Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 54th episode of the Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty podcast. First of all, before we start, I want to say that on the West, Catholics and Protestants are, as you know, celebrating Easter today. So, everyone who is celebrating, I just want to say Christ is risen. Happy Easter. And no, Easter has nothing to do with the pagan fertility goddess Ishtar. And now that we have hopefully put that debate off, even though I know that's not enough, we'll have to explain in details what we mean by that. But hopefully we can do that some other episode. I just want to honor and welcome back our friend Troy, who wasn't here on the podcast for a while. So I'm very excited and I'm very honored and humbled that despite the busy season when people are spending time with their families, which is very normal, right, that he found time in his schedule to spend a couple of hours with us. Troy, my friend and brother, welcome back. Thank you so much. And as the introduction, can you please tell us something about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me back on. I really enjoyed the last time that we got to sit down and talk. Let's see, my name's Troy Yurchak. I've been a Christian in non-denominational circles for, since I was real little. Grew up in a non-denominational style Christian cult. About 10 years ago, I rededicated my life to Christ after I got out of the Navy and have been really focused on getting back to the roots, being kind of a radical, radical, and got ordained as I was an ordained minister. Worked as a elder in one of the churches. Was about to be the associate pastor. Kind of decided to look for some discipleship, and in the process of all of that, someone introduced me to Orthodoxy, and up to that point, I didn't really realize how I didn't feel at home, and found home. So that's where I'm at now, which is why I'm not ordained anymore. But this type of conversation that you have on your podcast is one of the things that always interested me, the weird parts of scripture that we tend to just skip over. So Genesis 6 and the War of the Giants and things like that, cryptics or I can't say that word really well. The type of creatures that the Bible talks about that may cause us to go, what? And everybody else just avoids. Those are the places I like to stick to and look into. So I'm an amateur Bible scholar, not really a scholar, just I love the Bible. So maybe an amateur Bible nerd. So that's me.
Hey, we're on the same page when it comes to so many things. I also love weird stuff, and I guess we don't have to apologize for that, right?
No.
I just want to say that tonight we'll be talking about War on the Giants, which is a very interesting topic, both when it comes to biblical theology, but also when it comes to these weird things. And this is a prime example how you can have both at one. Because sometimes if you're interested in weird things, academics and Christian professors, but even clergy, they may look at you like, why do you want these things? It's pure fiction. But you can show them that you can have solid and sound biblical theology combined with the weird and vague and fringe. But it's also backed up not just by the scripture, but also tradition, church fathers, and even some of the modern scholars. So
Yes.
welcome to the weird side of the podcast, right?
Yep.
Troy, let's start from the very beginning. I'm going to try to pronounce it. What is Gigantomachy, and
Yep.
why is this topic important for us today?
All right. Well, Gigantomachy is, I think it comes from the Greek, and it just means war on giants. And so if you look into it, you're going to see the war of the Titans versus the Greek gods. That's where it comes from. But as Josephus kind of alludes to, he sees that the same as the Genesis 6 story. So Gigantomachy is something that can also be applied when you're looking through scripture as this war on the giants. So I think it's really important because you see this thread started very early, even in Genesis, as early as Genesis 6 and then into 14. And all through scriptures, and you actually see some of the language that'll tie it to it all the way into Revelation, and definitely in the gospel. So I think that there is a thread of Gigantomachy that's woven through all of scripture. It's not the only thread that's woven through all of scripture, but it is one of them. So that's why I think it's important.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to say that we've been receiving messages from Carrie, Paul, and I hope more come when it comes to Easter.
Yeah.
I wish all of you also a happy Easter, happy resurrection season. These are all for people who've been following the podcast more often. They know these names because Troy and Carrie, uh, alongside with some other people like
Paul.
Sean or Sherman before, or like Joshua Davidson. They've been coming very often and helping us with different things on the podcast. And if Carrie's watching this, Carrie, I didn't forget our topic on the Queen of Heaven, which I can't wait to attack and dissect with you one day. That will be really awesome
That
topic.
sounds awesome.
I
Wow.
know, I know. And okay, before we start going to some of the Old Testament passages and see where was the first example of this war on the giants in the Old Testament, I just want to give some context. To be a giant is a sort of anti-theosis, which is to be almost divinized, to become more saint, more sanctified, becoming more glorified, made more in the image of Jesus. But if you were a giant, you were a fully demonized person. So that would mean opposite from what God's plan and God a likeness he knew was supposed to be. So to
Mhm.
be a giant is to be this opposite of God's creation and God's plan in you. So that giants in the Old Testament and in the extra biblical sources they were described as um, tall beings. They were filled with lust, with fury, with destruction. The word giant in both Greek and Aramaic means to be a bully, a tyrant, or a thug, a strongman, or a dictator. And
Mhm.
I got some of this info from Orthodox priests that you Troy sent to me, and I'm thankful for that. Also, they explained that when it comes to this topic, Israel was given specific commandments of warfare about the giant clans compared to other human residents of the land. For example, in Deuteronomy 20, Israel was given basic warfare rules, like the Israelites were not supposed to be too aggressive toward the Gentile inhabitants of the land. However, there is an exceptional list of the giant clans where Yahweh says that he's going to destroy them for all their wickedness by using Israel as the instrument. So God was giving not very harsh rules when it came to the ancient warfare when that was happening between Israel and other Gentile nations. But when it came to the giant tribes, God was giving this very strict and very harsh. It may seem without the context seems very unjust. Like God will use this Hebrew word kherem, which would mean that something is devoted for destruction or is being totally annihilated. So if we don't know the context of why would God do this,
Mhm.
many skeptics today, one of the reasons why they attack the Bible, especially the Old Testament, they say, well, God was too violent. Why would he wipe out everything? Why would he want, was God for genocide? And without the context, even as Christians, we may see like, we can shy away and think, oh my gosh, maybe that was still really happening.
Mhm.
But that wasn't that. So God was issuing this kherem command, and that was forbidden, cursed, or sinful, and is used both for something being set apart because people were cursed, like in this context, giants, or something was being set apart because they are holy.
Mhm.
Sometimes the word dedicated is used for both intentions. So something can be dedicated for holy purposes, but something can be dedicated for unholy purposes or to be destroyed because it's not from God. There's no cure, there is no salvation. God has to destroy the same way he did it with the flood, right?
Right.
To start over. So this is not a genocide. God wanted to blot out these evil practices from the face of the planet by using the Israelites.
Mhm.
Uh, and also, I want to add that wars against the giants or demonic forces is spiritual warfare. So when I was listening to that Eastern Orthodox podcast that you sent to me,
Mhm.
I was learning and picking up so many stuff that I didn't know before, and I'm
Right.
thankful for that. Even though it took me like 3 hours to finish it, and wrote notes,
Yeah.
but I was like, man, that podcast, Lord of the Spirits. By the way, I
Mhm.
would recommend. Doesn't matter what faith tradition or church you go to,
Mhm.
I always tell my people you should learn from anyone and be open-minded because these are also Christians, right? These are not
Yes.
your enemies.
Right.
So I would invite people to subscribe to the podcast and listen. They have so many good stuff over there. Um, Troy, when it comes to the first example of this spiritual warfare between Israel and the giants, we know that this was happening in Exodus 17 when
Mhm.
Moses and Israel was just about receiving law from God. They were like in Mount Sinai, and suddenly they were attacked by a certain tribe. Can you please tell us what was happening at this point?
All right. So when God gives the law in Exodus around Exodus 17, the Amalekites show up and they attack Israel. And it based on the context of the scriptures around that, you start seeing that this is a tyrant or giant clan. And this is if I remember correctly, this is the group that when Moses is asking, or not Moses, Joshua, is it Moses? Moses, yeah, when his hands are being raised, and that God is supernaturally allowing the Israelites, who were nothing more than much more than slaves with farming tools, to hold off and defeat this giant clan. That's what's going on here. So, but that's not actually where you first start seeing the idea of Gigantomachy, but this is the first where Israel's actually joining in the fight. So I don't know if you want to go back into some of the earlier passages where you see other clans that are related to Abraham join in, or if you want to just stick with this part right here and expand it a
Yeah,
little.
for the sake of context, yeah, you can mention them. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so if you go back into Genesis, there's also quite a few different stories that include giant clans and wars on them. So not to go into too much detail, because we might go into more detail later about it, is that there's a king, and I cannot remember how to say the name, but I think it's Shadowlomer. See, I'm not going to be able to get these names right anyways, but it was the king that was warring against Sodom and Gomorrah, that when he defeated Sodom and Gomorrah, he took Lot as captive, and Abraham rescued Lot from him. Well, all it says that he was warring against giant clans, including Sodom and Gomorrah. And then if you think about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and what you talked about, that the term for giant in both Aramaic and or Hebrew and in Greek is this bully and tyrant. What were the Sodomites like? Right? They were bullies and tyrants, right? And so it's this, you see this connection. So that's probably the earliest that you see humans involved in it, but it's actually earlier than that, because that's what Genesis 6 is about. The introduction to the flood is God warring against these tyrants, right? That the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, took wives, and their offspring became the Nephilim, or were the Nephilim, the great men of renown, which is where Josephus says, hey, the Gigantomachy of the Greek myths and legends fits almost right over the war against the giants that God does in Genesis 6 with the flood. So that's where you start seeing it, is that God started this war, and he invites people that are loyal to him to fight with him. Not to necessarily say that Shadowlomer, I don't know how to say that name, was actually loyal to Yahweh, but you do see Esau's descendants, the Edomites, fighting giants. You do see Lot's descendants, the Moabites, fighting giants, and you see that being expressed in Numbers and Deuteronomy, that the Israelites are not to take any land from the Moabites or the Edomites, not just because they're family, but because they took the land from giants, and that's their inheritance because of it. So,
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I should have expressed myself better when I said Exodus 17 is not
yep,
the first human experience, but the first experience with God's people, with the
yep.
Israelites. And now, when you gave us the context and we skip to Exodus 17, like you said, Israel is being attacked by the Amalekites. This was happening in the region of Mount Sinai.
Mm-hmm.
Moses met God face to face. He was given the law. They're about to wage war against the Amalekites. When they start losing, Moses is climbing, then he's held in two arms. He cannot hold them for too long. He's being helped, and I see another layer of this spiritual warfare here, because raising hands up and down does not bring war. I mean, victory in war as we
Right.
know it. But there's something symbolical and spiritual that God is doing through his through his hands being
Through us.
raised, through
Yep.
Moses' hands being raised. So now he's held by two men, and whenever his hands are going up, God gives the supernatural victory over the giants. It's not like God wouldn't do it a different way, but God
Mhm.
opted to do it through this way.
Absolutely.
And then you mentioned Esau. I don't know if you want to
Mhm.
continue maybe from this
Mhm.
point with his genealogy and how is this related to Amalekites and Moses.
All right. So genealogies always have some treasures, although they're extremely boring to us. But there's always little treasures in there. So when in Genesis 36, it's going over the genealogy from Esau on. And he has a son, and I don't remember them off the top of my head what his son's name was, but his son is said to have a concubine named Timnah, the sister of Lotan. And if anybody's done any of if you've had anybody talking about Leviathan on your show, you know that Lotan is that word. So Timnah, the sister of Leviathan, right? And she's a concubine, not his wife. So one of the things that we're going to talk about in a little more detail later is that there was a sexual side of, I mean, like in Genesis 6, there's a sexual side, a ritual side to making giants. Well, one of the sons of this concubine and um, Esau's grandson through his son and the concubine is named Amalek. And so you get potentially now there could be more Amaleks in the ancient world. So is it possible that this is not the Amalek that the Amalekites were named after? Yes, it's possible. But you see this side of things where this Timnah and her brother Lotan are from the Horite tribe. The Horites are a giant clan. So they're a giant clan. Esau's son switches sides, has offspring with a concubine, and creates the Amalekites potentially. That's who's warring against Israel at the mountain, at Mount Sinai. And you see this um, you see this narrative structure where when God is speaking to Moses about, hey, Canaan is your land. I'm giving you all of the land that you can see. But he talks about the sin of the land and the sin of the Amorites and the sin of the people there, or the iniquity of the people is not full-fledged yet, right? And so it may be like this, the Horites, the Amalekites are not fully tyrant, they haven't fully become tyrants yet. And God's giving them the 400 years or 500 years that Israel is enslaved in Egypt to repent. And if they don't, well, God uses Israel, as you said, as his instrument of judgment against these giant tyrant clans. It's very similar to Babylon being used against Israel as God's judgment, right? As a tool of God's judgment for when Israel became twisted by their idolatry, right? So, um, let's see, did I miss anything when it came to that? I guess we go through some of the sexual rights, which is a little weird. So, um,
Yeah, but I
the
think it's important, especially when we will be coming later to the section of King Og, and all
mhm,
of this is related. So I think, for the sake of audience, even though we know about these things, I think it will be interesting to summarize so that people will understand, as the
okay,
sake of the historical context. Yeah.
all right. So, there's a book called the Book of the Giants, or what's Gilgamesh. There's a story of Gilgamesh, and it talks about him being 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. And we're as modernists, we go, oh well, you get this many chromosomes from your father and this many chromosomes from your mother, you're half and half, and how it shows up, and we're thinking DNA. That's how we're thinking. But if we're talking about the context of this, you have people that stand in for gods, the kings, Malaks. That's where that word in Hebrew means king. Were considered gods, right? Pharaoh was considered a god, um, and these kings were considered gods. So that's one part divine. They would also be the hypostasis. That's a Greek word for the physical representation of that God in reality. They could be they could also be that physical representation of another God. So there's two divine, and then you have a concubine, right? So if it's a female God, the concubine is human, but also representative of the God, and the king's a God. And that king would go in, they'd consummate not marriage, but this sexual ritual, and the offspring would be considered 2/3 divine, whether that be the king and the God he represents and the human concubine, or the king, the human concubine, and the goddess that she represents. That's where you get the 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. And you see this with the well, we'll get into that with Og. I'll hold off on going through that detail when we get to Og, king of Bashan. So
yeah, let me just mention a couple of things just in this passage of Exodus 17 for the context. So Timnah, whom you mentioned, and who is from the tribe of Horite, as you mentioned, these were one of the Nephilim, mentioned in Deuteronomy 2:12. You said that she was a sister of Lotan. That's very interesting because in Hebrew, the proper pronunciation, the proper word is Leviathan, and Leviathan was the chaos monster that the Jews, but also not Jewish people, also their Gentile pagan nations, neighbors, they also believe in this chaos monster. So this gives another layer to that. But not only that, there's a third layer on top of this. Timnah was potentially a temple prostitute.
yes.
And I'm just skipping for some of these things. Timnah's people, the Horites, were one of those tribes that participated in demonic sexual rites. And this is connecting that she was just like that she was behaving like that, in that manner. Amalekites were the first defeated by Moses and Joshua. And in this context, like they're coming from Amalek, which comes from Eliphaz. And we see the whole this family tree is different than the Israelites family tree that will come from the vine line. Like God will try to have his pure divine line for the sake of Messiah being born one again. And on the other side, you see this wicked, twisted family line through the Amalekites, where they were like participating in these sexual rites for the sake of creating giants through, like you said, either a concubine or a priestess sleeping with a king. And by going through that sexual rite, a person like Gilgamesh, like a sort of a hero, a man of renown, a giant. And by saying giant, that doesn't mean he was 10 feet or taller, but for them, it was sort of a giant. So through this sexual rite, a person like that would be born. And then from this tribe, Amalekites are coming and they're waging war on Israel. So this is the first example of the Gigantomachy. I managed to pronounce this word, hallelujah. This is the first example when it comes between Israel, so God's people, and the giants in Exodus 17. And I don't know what you wanted to add on this.
Yeah, no, I think that kind of showing with the Amalekites that this thread is not just at the very beginning of Scripture, but it kind of weaves through Scripture, is that when Saul is king, he's told, you need to fight Agag and you need to kherem the Amalekites, and Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Saul, who for the sake of the people, or at least he says for the sake of their acceptance, doesn't kill the king, wants him as a trophy to show that he's a good warrior, and keeps all of the wealth, kind of like at Jericho, one of the soldiers who took some gold and some clothes. Jericho was supposed to be kherem, right? And he took something from it, and his entire family lost their lives because they took something that was dedicated to God, right? Through destruction, but dedicated to God. The same thing happens here. And Samuel's like, what is did you do everything that the Lord said? Yeah, I did everything. And then he goes, well, why do I hear the the lowing of cattle, and who is this talking about? Agag the king. And then Samuel beheads Agag. So that's the Amalekites. Saul loses his kingship after that, because that's when God says, look, I've rejected him. He's not going to obey me. He's not going to participate in Gigantomachy, right? Because the Amalekites are tyrants. He's not participating in it. He's lost his place as king. Now I'm going to go look for someone else. And then you get the story of David, right? But that's not the end of the story of the Benjaminites, which is where Saul comes from, and the Amalekites. Because Esther, when you get to that point, Mordecai and Haman, Mordecai is from the tribe of Benjamin, and Haman is an Agagite, a descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And so once again, you see a tyrant and a bully being fought against, and Mordecai is redeeming Saul's story. Much like, and there's so many of these little threads across scripture that you don't actually think are all connected, but they do, right? And this is just a side thing, it's not necessarily Gigantomachy, but you see this with Peter. Peter sent and given a vision, hey, don't call what I've called clean unclean. And what does Jesus call Peter? Peter, son of Jonah. What was Jonah's job? Right? So you see these threads across scripture, across big swaths of scripture, that it's hard to follow unless you know what you're looking for. It's that little gold thread. So this would be one of those, is that you have the Amalekites in competition, whether on a grand scale, army to army, or in a small scale, person to person, all the way through Esther.
Yeah, I just want to read something that Carrie said. And the interesting thing with Saul not participating in that is that he's described as a giant himself, tall, being from a particular region that has a reputation. And
Yes.
yet, that's true. Saul was taller for the bigger
Head and
than all of
shoulders.
his friends, for the whole, for the size of the whole head, and he still didn't dare. He was probably in similar size,
Goliath.
like Goliath, and he was supposed to be the one who was supposed to face him in the duel, and he decided to go away. And you're like, no, but you were born for a time like this. You're
Yes.
supposed to like
Right.
fight him in a duel, but then you decided to stay away from
Right.
this.
There's the term Gibor or Giborim, mighty men. That's applied in both the positive and negative. It's applied to the tyrants, right? Nimrod, right? He became a Gibborim, right? He became a mighty hunter in the face of God, like against God, and he's the one that started Babylon and the ziggurats and all that. So you have this negative tyrant picture, but then you also have the Gibborim of David, the mighty men of David. It's used both ways. It's like Saul, like Carrie said, Saul was called to be that Gibborim on the righteous side, and he chose to walk away, and later on, when it comes to Goliath, to cower with someone based on the Greek Septuagint and older texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls would put Goliath within 3 inches height of Saul. If you think about, if everybody there is about 5'4", and the scriptures say that Saul is head and shoulders above the rest of all the Israelites, so that puts him about 6'4" and 6'9". Okay, we're right within the same thing. He shouldn't. It's not a huge difference, and he chooses to be a coward and hide. So
I appreciate those numbers. I didn't know what the numbers in the Septuagint giving. Yeah, so thanks for that. Okay, so the second example of war of against the giants between Israel and between these demonized people, as the Orthodox priests describe them in that way, and I like that stick to my mind, is found in Numbers 13. So Moses sends the spies to go spy and scout on this promised land, and they come back, and most of them come back with negative report. And a negative report is that even though the land is quote unquote flowing with milk and honey, their people and their fortresses are huge, so we are scared, maybe we shouldn't go and attack. However, there are two people sticking out from that crowd, from those spies, Josh and Caleb, who are they do acknowledge, the facts are facts, right? Numbers are numbers. but they're not becoming cowards and wanted to, like Saul and the other spies, and they don't want to chicken out and go away. They're ready for battle. So maybe you can continue telling us, what was happening in Numbers 13, and if you want to continue, if you want to do some cross-referencing with
Mhm.
Exodus 23, Amorites, anything of that sort, it's up to you.
Yeah, no, I definitely want to get into that. I think that we have a tendency with people that are mildly interested in this to pick out a couple words that are repeated often enough that we go, okay, this must be something important. Anakim for one, Rephaim for another, Nephilim, which is interesting because it's only really mentioned in a few places, but those are the three main words that when referenced in people that are curious about these types of things, they're going to recognize right away. But those are not the only names associated with that. So I do want to do a little bit of a cross-reference before we get into all the wars that were going on in Numbers 13, as well as getting into Joshua. But so I'm not going to read the verses, but I do want to call some verses out. So in Numbers 13, it talks about the sons of Anak being Nephilim. In Exodus 23, verses 23 through 24, it mentions that Amorites, which we've in previous verses, now I might be able to pull out a couple of those, are confirmed as Rephaim, but it includes them with a list of other tribes with the mandate to kherem, completely destroy, implying they're also considered Rephaim. And that's the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Jebusites, keep that in mind, that's what David wars against and removes them from Jerusalem. That's where Jerusalem gets its name, Jebusites, right? And the Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites are all offsprings of Canaan, the cursed son of Ham. So it's interesting that this might be, the question that always comes up with Genesis 6 is that little statement that says these were the Nephilim that were there before the flood and afterwards. Well, where are they coming from? Well, once again, we've talked about this sexual ritual, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, and you have this sexual fault of Ham that produces Canaan. And I have a theory about that, but that's kind of beside the point. But Canaan is the offspring of some form of sexual deviancy. And maybe that's where this started, is that after the flood, you've got the very first, this sexual deviant behavior, and something happens from that, producing Canaan. Canaan is cursed, and his offspring turn out to be tyrants. Let's see. Another one in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, which is a little bit further away, but there's a list of Rephaim that goes along with that from different tribes and different people that have actually fought, the Moabites and the Edomites. Anakim, Emim, Horites, once again, that's repeated. Zamzamin, Avim, I don't know how to pronounce these, so I'm doing my best. And the Amorites, which that's Sihon and Og, king of Bashan. We've mentioned him a couple different times. So there's one other one in Genesis 14 talking about Shador Lomer. Man, that's a hard word to say. It talks about the Rephaim that he defeated, the Zuzim and Ham, the Emim, and I'm not going to try to pronounce where that's at, and the Horites. So once again, man, Horites have been mentioned 3 or 4 times, and we already talked about how Timnah, the sister of Lotan, is a part of the Horite tribe. Another one is Genesis 36. It repeats Zuzim, Emim, Horites. Amalekites are included in this one, which we already talked about. Amorites are included once again. And in this list from Genesis 36 and Genesis 14, the kings in Sodom and Gomorrah are considered a part of this group. So, and like we already mentioned, there's this tyrannical nature in the culture. It's not just the king that's a giant. It's the entire culture is tyrannical. That's the thing that if anybody has the chance to listen to the Lord of Spirits episode in the Land of Giants, they go into great detail about it's not just a genetic marker. It's not, they could be tall, But that's not the main thing. It's that their way of living was tyrannical. Cannibalism was quite often put in there. The tyrannical, like you said, full of lusts, not just sexual lust, but all the lust. They were um, slaves to their passions. And this kind of reminds me of the story of Saint Christopher, in the East, or in the East, the dog-headed saint, or in the West, it's just the giant. He's a Rephaim, and he's not allowed the not to go through his whole story, but he's rejected from the Christian community, and he's downtrodden because he wants to serve the most powerful king. And he knows that Christ is the most powerful king, but the community of serfs that are his servants won't let him in and won't be baptized. And he goes to a monk that's on a mountain. He goes, well, if they won't let you in and you can't pray because you can't lift your eyes to heaven, well, why don't you serve the community and carry people across this river back and forth? Because of your great stature and strength, you're able to do that. And he serves the community for years. And then there's a child that shows up, and it's during the flooding season. He's exhausted. He doesn't want to do it. He's already done it 10 times that day. And he's like, can it wait till tomorrow? And the child's like, no, I need you to carry me over. And so he decides, against his better judgment, to carry this child over. And as he's walking across, the child gets extremely heavy, almost drowns him. But he continues on, and he's like, I got to give up. And the child's like, no, you can make it. He makes it to the other side. And then it's revealed that it's Christ. And he changes his name from Reprobus to Christopher, and says, you bore Christ. So
you bore Christ, but then Christ bore all the sins of the world. So imagine this. In a way, this is almost a parallel to the pagan god Atlas. And now we are digressing too much, but I just want to
it's a rabbit trail. Cool. Yeah. No, it's really good. And that's the thing, is that when we're talking about these giants, it's not a genetic thing that the war against the giants is after. It's not like how much of my genetic material is giant, right? That's not the right question. It's what in my life is living completely submitted to the passions that makes me a subject to tyranny and makes me tyrannical, right? And if I can eradicate those things in my life, I've eradicated the giant in me, right? Like Saint Christopher, or in the cultures of in the Gigantomachy, specifically when it comes to Jews, if you eradicate those that are faithful to this ritual life of tyranny and cannibalism, then you've eliminated the giants. So if that's elimination by war and killing them, okay. But if that's eliminating them by conversion, that's also a way to kherem, completely destroy that way of life. So that, I think that is probably, for me, was probably the best way to approach the book of Joshua, which seems on the face, it seems like it's just genocide, but it's written in the same way that the pharaohs talk about their exploits against we didn't lose a single person, and 80,000 people died. Okay, that's not really realistic, but that is hey, if God is on our side, that's what it's going to be like. That's the same thing here. So
let me just read this message from Paul. He makes a good point when because we were just talking about Exodus 23 and Amorites. He says the Amorites are also the ones that started the Babylonian Empire. It's not a coincidence. Also cannibals and the first recorded traders of slaves as market and not just war spoils. That's a good point. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I just want to read before we skip to another topic. I know that you wanted to say more about Anakim, and again, going back to the Numbers 13. So sorry, I just wanted to read the message.
Yep. Oh, absolutely. That's a really great point. And you're seeing it's the tyranny owning people and that type of stuff that you see. It's not just this genetic marker. And I think that seems to be something that a lot of people that get into the giant things, and you see people like Tom Horn and Steve Quayle, not to necessarily call out names, but they have such a conspiratorial approach to this that, how much percentage of your DNA can be giant and you still be saved? And it's like, stop. That's not the thing. You can become a giant by being enslaved to your passions, like Nimrod, and you can stop being a giant by submitting your passions and stop being a tyrant. So, anyways, that's a little on the preachy side, so I'm gonna stop now. Yeah, so we have this group called the Anakim. It's probably the most famous of them. And you see, first I want to go through the promise that Moses tells the children of Israel, that why they're being given the land and why they have to war for it. It says in Deuteronomy 9:12, as Israel's about to cross the Jordan, it says, you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the sons of Anakim, whom you know, and whom you have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak. So it's showing them as great stature, but like we said multiple times, it's not necessarily that they are just giant in stature. If you're thinking about it, a good one, someone who accomplished many great things and was larger than life, Hitler, but he was horrible, right? He's a giant. He fits the tyranny that we're talking about here. So who were the Anakim?
He's like Nimrod II or something like that.
Yes.
In a bad way, giant.
Yes, absolutely, in a horrible way, right? So what are the Anakim? They were descendants of a man named Anak. He had 3 sons, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce these properly. Seshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. And you see that in Joshua 15:14 and Judges 1:10 and 20. Joshua later devotes them to destruction, but he leaves a few out. Like, he doesn't get it out of all of the land of Canaan. The places that are left over is the place surrounding Gaza, the place surrounding Gath, and the place surrounding Ashdod, which is that section right now, the Gaza Strip, and a little bit north of the Gaza Strip. If we're looking at historical, if you're looking at the maps. So,
since he left few, not just in Gaza, but also in Gath, and we see that Goliath is coming from this place, from this location and tribe, and he's descendant of Anak. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to speculate, but I'm just wondering, what if Joshua devoted to destruction all of them, would Goliath came to be later and come to provoke Israel, and David could to come and deal with him. I don't know. It's just an interesting speculation. What if?
Well, like we talked about, Saul's failure to participate fully in Harem when it comes to Gigantomachy, and that his story, the Benjamin story, has a redemption arc that goes all the way to the book of Esther with Haman and Mordecai. I think the same thing goes here, is that that's the preach side of it. How do you apply it? What they left, what Joshua left uncompleted, the next generation or the generations after have to finish, right? Which is why you see David having to fight Goliath, is because the job was not complete. Israel's participation in Gigantomachy, the way that God wants them to participate, had not been complete yet. So I think that you're right. If Joshua would have done it, there would be no need for what occurred with Goliath and David, because there would be no Goliath. So that's a really good question, though.
Yeah, and I just want to add that Caleb, who came right after Joshua, he finished this work. So he drove out the rest of the Anakim from Hebron. We see this in later chapters of Joshua, like 14, 15, Judges 1. And then in Numbers 13:33, we see that these sons of Anak are coming from the Nephilim, which is just another indicator, another evidence that we're not inventing these stories just because we like giants and vague fringe topics. No, we're trying to do a proper biblical theology by assessing not just the biblical text in Hebrew and dissect these meanings, but also cross-reference them with other verses. And occasionally we mention scholars like these Eastern Orthodox priests and their podcast, Lord of Spirits, or like sometimes, when we quote what Dr. Heiser is saying. So again, this is very interesting to follow this thread when it comes from Genesis to the rest of the Pentateuch, so the first
Mhm.
books of the Torah, of the Old Testament, and then even later what we'll be reading from this historical narrative. So by saying that, we're done with this section of the Anakim, who are
Mhm.
again just the tribe of Nephilim, coming in Numbers 13. And now we're moving to Moses dealing with another type of the giants. And this is a very famous story that not just us, but many people who, we listen to their podcasts, we read
Mhm.
their articles and books. They're dealing with explaining, why was uh, King Og so important? Who were actually these bulls of Bashan?
Right.
Without the context, we can just read and think, well, these were just mere animals. But we
Right.
later see in Psalms when Jesus, so well, they don't know it was Jesus, but the Messiah was surrounded by these bulls of Bashan, by these demonic entities, which was in the vicinity, that belonged to King Og of
Mhm.
Bashan, who was called one of the last Rephaim, if not even the last of those.
Yes.
So when it comes to these passages of Deuteronomy 2 and 3 and Moses dealing with King Og, what is important that you would like to share with the audience?
All right. So with Deuteronomy 2, you get a list of the giants and Nephilim that were fought by the descendants of Lot and the descendants of Edom, or descendants of Esau, so Edom and the Moabites, and that they're being told, hey, just like I drove, just like I did for the Moabites and just like I did for the Edomites, I'm going to war against the giants, the ones that you're about to face. So that's what you see in Genesis 2 or Deuteronomy 2. So in Deuteronomy 3, it's talking about two specific kings. The first one being Sihon, and that's they meet him on the other side of the Jordan and they win. And so Deuteronomy 3 is calling back to the winning against that Amorite king, a giant, um, and how they beat him, and going, I'm going to do the same to Og, king of Bashan. Okay, so in Deuteronomy 3, it says that Og was the last of the Rephaim, or one of the last of the Rephaim kings, which, like you've mentioned multiple times, it's the fully demonized person, right? He's demonized, and I think that this is a good point to kind of plug the episodes that you did with Tim. I forgot his last name. Stedman. There we go. I think it's episode 17 and 21. They're really good groundwork for everything that we've been discussing here. So, anyways, if anybody wants to go back and listen to those, they were really good, and they're going to tie in with everything that we're talking about here.
And I will be posting links for those two episodes and for all the material we're quoting tonight from the Orthodox priest from the Lord of Podcast. I was about to
Lord of
say
Spirits.
for the Lord of the Spirits podcast, and also Dr. Heiser's article and his Reversing Herman book. So all the material, all the data will be in the video description just after the episode is over.
Right. So one of the things that Stedman covered was that the Rephaim became the demonic spirits of the underworld. The Rephaim is a particular group of giant kings. So it's more specific than the Nephilim, which is just any of the giants. But these are specific giant kings. There are dolmens or stone tombs in the former Bashan area, nowadays called the Golan Heights. I believe it was called the Valley of the Rephaim. And you can still see some of the megalithic or monolithic structures. I think it's megalithic. Huge structures of stone, piled stone that makes spirals and interesting shapes in the Valley of the Rephaim today. This was close to Mount Hermon, and this region was the center of evil corruption. In the Greek Old Testament tradition, many times when it says Gog and Magog in English, if you look at the Hebrew and Greek, everywhere that Gog or Magog is used in the Greek Septuagint and in the New Testament, well, in the New Testament, you don't have a Hebrew New Testament, right? So Gog and Magog is in Revelation, and Gog and Magog is in the Old Testament Septuagint. Every place that you go, all right, what does that say in the Hebrew Old Testament, the Masoretic text? It says Og. So you can look at that and go, oh, so Og, king of Bashan, is being referenced in the prophets, is being referenced in Revelation. What is the big deal about this giant king? Do you mind if I share something real quick? I wanted to give people an
No,
overhead
you're good.
view.
Yeah,
Right.
we have time. Yeah, but while you're looking for what you want to share, I just want to say what you said to because this is amazing, and we are waiting for the fulfillment of this, what is supposed to come. So King Og, which was his bed was huge. He was last of the refined kings, right? The fully demonized being. He shows up, and in Greek translation of the Old Testament, where it's mentioned uh, Gog and Og and Magog would be in Hebrew. In Hebrew Old Testament will be with Gog. So now G almost disappears, and it's not Gog and Magog, it's Og. And Og was again this refined, demonized king. And then in Revelation, like you said, this is it's spoken about that he's coming back as the leader of the evil. So I mean, come on. If you love God, if you love theology, if you love Bible, if you love these weird, spooky things, you have to be like interested. Like, well, how will this work out? Like, are you telling me these beings may come back, and how as demons will they be embodied? And there's so much we don't know. But like, I hope this is trying to provoke you to think and study and want to read more. Right? I'm gonna share this what you shared. I just want to mention this to the audience because when we were taking notes for tonight, this was for me at least. When Gog and Magog switched to Og and Magog, for me this was one of the most fascinating parts of the material for tonight, especially knowing that Og is coming back. How is he coming back? Because he was slain thousands of years ago. Well, his spirit is not dead yet, so we'll see how that works in the end of days.
Yes. So if you see this picture, it's kind of a overview of, you see the Mediterranean Sea up there, you see Mount Carmel over there, you see the Sea of Galilee. I don't know if you can't see my pointer, so no worries about that. All right, but dead center, you see Bashan, right? So Og, king of Bashan, is king of this entire area, and just north of Bashan is Mount Hermon. So when it talks about in scripture, when it talks about the tyrants from the north, it's not talking about Russia, which Gog and Magog, that's the type of Tom Horn and Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins with the Left Behind series. All of those were misunderstanding this and not recognizing that the tallest peak that Israel would have known about is Mount Hermon. It's about 9,000 feet, if I'm remembering what I read correctly. It's about 9,000 feet above any of the other peaks around the area. So it's the tallest peak. So you see where Mount Hermon is, and Bashan is right south of it. Mount Hermon is the place where all of the Canaanite tribes, Ugaritic and all the other tribes that are in that area, believed that their gods descended on the earth and made the Rephaim kings, the Nephilim. So you have this deep cultural seedbed of stories that Mount Hermon is the place where the gods descended, little g, and Og is the king that is closest to this place. So I want you to see this, because there's something I want to bring up in the New Testament later on, but I'm hopefully we get there. But I just wanted you to see this map so you can see, here's Bashan, here's Mount Hermon. All right. So here's another. No, that's good. Okay. I can stop sharing now. So.
Okay. I'll remove it. Yeah. Okay.
There we go. Yeah. So where Og is closest to the place where all the cultures that Israel is now fighting, these giant cultures, would think that their gods are from. So Og is like the last defense against the onslaught of their most holy mountain, if you see it from that perspective, right? So
I'm sorry, I just want to add, like, this is another layer of spiritual warfare. You see Mount Sinai fighting Mount Hermon. You see
Yes.
God Mountain attacking I don't know if I can call it the devils, but you can see it attacking enemies mountains. So this is where topics and words and terms such as cosmic geography and things of that sort come to bring another layer of biblical theology, where you have to study not just biblical text but also extra biblical stuff that maybe even written by non-Christian authors, but doesn't matter if they're true. They're helpful to us to understand how the ancient people saw certain mountains as holy, who was dwelling there, what was important about the height, and what gods dwelled in these regions, and all these things that make us see the whole bigger picture. And then hopefully there will be a light bulb above our head saying, now I understand Bible better. But
Right.
yeah, please continue.
All right. So with Og, there was this legend that goes along with it, and they say in our scriptures that you could still see his bed. It was 15 feet long and at least 6 feet wide, right? And given that we've already given some of the context of the how you get 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, this is that ritual bed. So whether or not they were actually 15 feet tall is inconsequential to there actually was an iron bed that was discovered in this area that was 15 feet tall. So whether or not there was 15-foot giants, the ritual that this is alluding to was going on. And so we have, let's see, Etemenanches, the Tower of Babel king, was the high priest who would ritually embody the god through sacrifices and blood drinking, and then have sex with a temple slave or temple prostitute on that bed. Child born would have 2 fathers and 1 mother. And we've already covered most of this previously. So the same thing goes with if it was a priestess and they represented the god. Okay, so that's where you get this. That's the bed that this would happen on. It's in the ritual understanding, like you can see this in the description of Dagon and Dagon's temple and Samuel, is that their understanding of their gods were about 15 feet tall when they manifested to humanity. So that's, once again, whether or not they were actual physically giants that size, their ritual interaction with their gods, the gods that they interacted with, manifested at that height. So I'm not as good with references outside of scripture. There are scholars that have talked about that. And so don't take my word for it. Look for that. You don't have to take my word for it. That's the main point of that. So this type of ritual is not just tied to Canaan. You see this across the globe. So Egyptians have something very similar to this. This is close to the Ugaritic, which was something recently discovered in the last 30, 40 years. The Sumerians also talk about this ritual in their text. And today it's actually happening in Japan. And over history, you could see that there's something very similar when it comes to the ziggurats. The house at the top of the ziggurats would have a ritual room for things like this. And that's global, even when you're talking about the Incas and the Mayans, right? And one of the things that was talked about, whether or not anybody agrees with what Columbus did when it comes to the Incas and Mayans, one of the things that he did see was the cannibalism and the human sacrifice and the blood drinking, which is what we've been talking about when it comes to these giants, is that whether or not we think Columbus is justified in some of the tyrannical ways he treated people that he met here, he did find people that were doing things like this. So anything else you wanted to touch base on this one, this point?
Well, I said that I would say that I also plan in the future to do an episode on God's divine justice on all the previously destroyed nations and civilizations that existed at one point in history, just because they're dealing with forbidden rituals, serving gods without repenting and coming to Yahweh. And eventually, after centuries of God giving them grace and period to repent, they would not do that. God will eventually punish them. This was happening, like you said, with Incas, with Mayas or Aztecs. Before that, we covered the episode on Atlantis. I want to do an episode just just dedicated to how God in his mercy allows period of repentance, but for the sake of the earth, because the earth symbolically, Bible mentions this, the earth
Yes.
cannot take so much unjust and
Bloodshed.
ungodly sacrifices, bloodshed. So it's literally like screaming to God to be delivered, even the soil, right? So
Yes.
God has to come and deliver for the sake of the remnant of the elect people, the holy people who are not to be, who are supposed to come as living temples and sanctify the land by living righteously. And that reminds me of I didn't plan to mention this, but that reminds me of a story, of a testimony of some new converted Christian couple or a whole family in Africa whose, their non-Christian friends would not be able to grow their crops to be very successful. But when these people came to Christ and dedicated their whole lives, including food and crops, to
Oh,
Christ,
wow.
their produce would grow bigger, and that will be a testimony to others. I heard this years ago, but that's my point. Like, God will come to sanctify the land, and even if it means removing clans, they're like
Yep.
living completely ungodly, wicked, sacrificing children,
Yes.
eating each other, spilling blood after blood, generation after generation, in an ungodly, wicked way, God will come and remove them. And
Absolutely.
I just want to dedicate once in the future an episode just for that. Yeah, when it comes to this point, I mean, not to this point, but to this section of Deuteronomy 2 and 3, and Moses defeating King Og of Bashan, I just want to say that this is very um, very tightly connected with what we previously mentioned when it comes to Gilgamesh, and how these beings will be produced that will be considered to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 just humans. We already mentioned that, and that again we see in these sections of the scriptures, Deuteronomy 2 and 3 and many others, that again God is calling Israel to kherem, to devote this the inhabitants of this land, which will be coming from the giants, to complete destruction, or to be devoted to God, right? And if it comes through conversion, okay, but most of the time it will come through destruction. But why? Not because God is merciless, because God will give time to everyone to repent.
Yes.
And after, we already mentioned it, and after that time is up, like, I'm sorry, but like the land has to be cleansed. So the
Yes.
same thing happened with the flood. And no
And
wonder
Sodom and
God said
Gomorrah.
in Genesis 6, like, God was,
Yep.
he regretted creating people when he saw what people are capable of doing. And this also comes with, what Mesopotamian, Babylonian, sources were saying that Apkallu came and they gave this secret knowledge to people. We see this also Enoch. It's not mentioned as Apkallu, but the watchers. So when God sees that these things that people are receiving, hidden information from these entities, and they're using it, for astrology. They're using it to make potions. They're using it to create warfare and metallurgy, and use it for mass destruction of other people. Then
Yes.
God comes and has to prevent something like that.
Yes.
So I just want to say that in that context, whenever we read devoted for destruction or complete annihilation, we have scholars like Dr. Heiser, who explains and devotes his whole chapters of the book, but also his I included the link to his online article where he explains that, for example, he says, those who have read my book, The Unseen Realm, they know that I have this atypical perspective on the conquest in the Old Testament, right? He says the contention by many that Israelite conquest was an indiscriminate genocide of the inhabitants of Canaan. But my view is that it wasn't indiscriminate at all, and that the wholesale genocide wasn't the point of the conquest. Rather, the command to devote to destruction, which is kherem, was focused on the giant clans, which was used by words like Anakim, Rephaim, and occasionally Amorites. We will skip all that section, but Dr. Heiser has many good things to say about it. And again, the host of the podcast, Lord of the Hosts, those two wonderful Eastern Orthodox priests, they align with Dr. Heiser in many things he has to say. So we'll just skip that for the sake of time.
Yes.
And we can skip to maybe Deuteronomy 2, just after quoting Heiser. we can say that Deuteronomy 2 provides some interesting information about this clan, like right, the Rephaim. It says that Rephaim were tall as the Anakim, but were mostly wiped out by Yahweh himself in Deuteronomy 2:21. The Ammonites called the Rephaim by the name Zamzumim in Deuteronomy 2:20. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 says that Emim were also as tall as the Anakim. So whenever we have to pay attention to these small details in the scripture. Why would the author, of these passages say, well, these were tall as this? Like, how is this important to us? Or like you said earlier, like, who likes to read genealogies? But there's small details that have significant theological importance if we pay attention and connect with other previous passages with the same terms or names were used. We're like, this is why it makes sense, right?
Yes.
So Emim were also as tall as Anakim, but then it says that both the Anakim and Emim are also counted as Rephaim. Oh, so you're telling me that these clans are also being destroyed because they're coming from Rephaim. So these were not just regular people, families with their kids, just minding their own business, being neutral. It's nothing like that. And
Yes.
this is important because it links the Anakim with Rephaim. And while King Og was one of the less of the Rephaim, there were still Rephaim in the land, namely the Anakim and the descendants of Rapha, mentioned in 2 Samuel 21. Do you want to maybe continue from that point when we
I can
talk about
continue
Genesis
from
14 and your favorite guy, Cheddar? We both pronounce his name.
It's really hard to pronounce his name, but it's just keeping that in mind, that when you're looking here when it comes to Og, king of Bashan. So just a point that I was just remembering is that he's the last of the Rephaim kings. It doesn't mean he's the last Rephaim, right? So then you're seeing this in 2 Samuel. You're seeing it when the sons of Anak, Goliath being one of those descendants, is being attacked. You're seeing that in the story continuing, that the importance of what God asked Saul to do and all of that is, hey, I want you to continue in this. You'll have peace in the land when you complete your conquest of the giant clans. All right, so let's see. So it says that Chedorlaomer, I can't say that again. It seems he fought three distinct groups of giants. The Rephaim, the Septuagint actually translates Rephaim in Genesis 14 as giants. The Zuzim, which is probably what you've already read earlier, the Zamzumim. It's very similar. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not a linguist and I don't know Hebrew that well, but there might be a linguistic connection between Zuzim and Zamzumim. That's from Deuteronomy 2:20. And then the Emim. So the Amorites may also have been giants. Amos 2:9 says that the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and Sihon and Og were also both considered Amorites. So you have, like what Heiser says earlier, the part that you read, is that Amorites are sometimes included, sometimes not. Like I said, this may not just be, it may not be that every single one of them, every single human in these groups are giants, but that they were allies with, right? So Amorites come in and out of being Rephaim depending on how tyrannical they are in the moment. That makes sense if we're holding to that view. That's why they would come in and out of that. Let's see. So Deuteronomy 31, 3-6, this is the command from Moses at the end of his life to the people of Israel before he turns over to Joshua. It says the Lord, Deuteronomy 31, 3-6, the Lord your God himself will go over before you. He will destroy these nations before you, so that you shall dispossess them. And Joshua will go over at your head, as the Lord has spoken. And the Lord will do to them as he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, and to their land when he destroyed them. Notice that Israel's the one that did the fighting, but God is taking credit for it, because it is just like we talked about Moses' arms going up and down, determined whether or not the Israelites were winning, which means the Israelites were not capable without supernatural help, right? It's that God is the one that's actually utilizing Israel as the tool to judgment. And the Lord will give them over to you, and you shall do to them according to all the commandment which I have commanded you. Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear or or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. So notice that it's God, the one that's actually warring against the giants, and Israel is his tool at that point. Not necessarily a tool, that's probably the wrong word, his partner in this, that it's his power working through his partner, Israel. So now you get Joshua and Caleb. This is one of the parts that I really find
I'm sorry, I just want to add one thing. In this part of Deuteronomy 31, 3-6, there we see another layer of spiritual warfare where God would not just, I mean, yeah, of course, God can say if you're concerned because you're outnumbered by any sort of enemy, God can tell you to, calm down and trust in him, rely on his strength, his spirit, that he will come, fight for you and overcome. So in that context, yes. But if we know the context that all these clans are coming from Rephaim and Nephilim, then what he says, do not fear or be in dread. To be in dread of someone or something is even worse than just having fear. So why would they fear? Well, imagine an army of I don't know, I don't want to come up with some number because it's all hypothetical, but for the sake of the argument, imagine dozens or hundreds of people who are coming from the giant clans. They're like taller than all your people. They can wear this scale armor like Goliath. They're like significantly thick. They can run and move fast with all this armor. Their clubs and their weapons of destruction are way bigger than you. You cannot hurt these people so much without divine intervention. So in that context, God comes and says, do not be in dread of them, because everyone normal, I don't care how much you're godly, everyone normal will say, hey, I don't know if we should attack them. Look, we are less than them and we're smaller than them. They will just wipe us out. Yeah. But then God comes and says, wait, rely on me. I will be going with you. I'll be heading in front of you and bringing you this victory if you rely on me and proclaim my name. And this is what's happening. So we see another, like I said, another layer of spiritual warfare. That section, when he says do not be in dread of them, for me makes so much sense, because everyone who is like, again, you can be as spiritual as you want to be, but you'll be like, if you see someone like this, and there's not just one, there's multitudes of them, like, man, like I don't have any chance against them. Like that makes so much more sense. And it's real, like the Bible is real with us, because God understands that we will be in fear of such an enemy. That is like because they're not from the same, they're not the same type of enemy like human enemies. But even with them, you can be scared if you're outnumbered. But in this context with giant army, even if there were like only few dozens of them, I mean, it honestly would make you shake and want to leave and want to go.
I think that you're dead on when it comes to that, because one, this is contrasting the first attempt before the 40 years wandering in the wilderness, where they send the 12 spies and 10 of them have a bad report, and Joshua and Caleb are the only ones that have a good report, is that the people were afraid. And because of that, God was like, this is not the people. They don't trust me enough to follow me to a place where it's only through me, only through God, that they are going to be able to accomplish what I've asked them to do. It's not the right generation. All right, I'll do it with the next generation. What does he tell the generation that's passing away? That it'll be your kids. Like the ones that can barely walk now are going to be the ones that take on giants. And you let that opportunity go. And this one, he's going, look, you already spent 40 years as, 20 and under, 40 years wandering in the wilderness because of your parents' choice to not trust me and take on these giants that are way more powerful than you could ever be on your own. But I'm with you. I'm going before you. I'm making war on them. You're just my partner in this. I will protect you. Right? It's like it's a movie from it's probably the 80s called The Bear. And there's a point where this mountain lion is harassing this baby bear, but this baby bear earlier on in the story had helped a bull bear, a male bear. And he's running from this lion, but eventually he gets caught in one spot, and he like turns around and tries to scream at the lion, and it's this really sad thing. And the lion keeps getting closer, and then all of a sudden the lion stops and starts backing away and running. And the bear's just, the little cub is giving all of its effort into being intimidating and screaming, but it's not much. And then the lion runs off, and then he turns around, and it's the giant bear behind him, standing on its hind legs, roaring, behind him. And it's like, that's the thing. That's what this is calling out. And you see this in the Psalms. And this, while you were talking, I was like, man, sorry for this rabbit trail. It's not on the outline. You see this in the Psalms where it says, you make a table for me in the presence of my enemies. It's like, if I trust him, I can be at rest in war. I can be enjoying a meal while at war. Why?
And guess what? God is setting this table by defeating my enemies, so I can just come and enjoy. I'm not saying being completely, passive and just observing, but it's putting God behind the wheel. You're the passenger, but God is, that those memes, Jesus take the wheel.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you see another meme, Jesus took too many wheels. That doesn't mean that you're completely passive and just doing nothing. Right. But it means that when you rely on the Lord, He's the one who's making that supper where the enemy is being served, so to speak, in a symbolical way, because God is bigger than the enemy, but the enemy is bigger than you. You have to know your place. Yes. So you can defeat this semi-divine enemy only if you have divine entity in you, and only God is bigger than them.
Yes, and I think that's exactly what Jude and Peter were talking about when they said, hey, these people rail against authorities that they don't know who they're actually dealing with. And even Michael the archangel, when he's contending for Moses's body with Satan, says, the Lord rebuke you. That even Michael the archangel, a being that we would consider more powerful personally than us, even he's recognizing, nope, the only way that I win the battle is through the Lord. And that we need to have that same humility, that God's called us to not fear death. God's called us to move forward and do these spiritual warfare against enemies we can't defeat on our own. But it's Christ in us, the hope of that glory. And it's so sorry getting on the preachy side of it, and we haven't even got to that point because this get all wrapped up.
Let me just please read Carrie's comment. She says, it makes me wonder what kind of clothing or armor they had, right? So these giant clans. You look at some cannibalistic societies that do human sacrifice, for instance. Some societies really do know how to create that level of fear. As I was reading Carrie's words, I thought of the movie 13 Warrior, where like right at the beginning, they think like their enemies are like something out of this world. And later they see, oh, these are actually torches they have. It's not like a fiery serpent or dragon, but they're very good in intimidating their opponents, right? By, putting certain stuff as the warfare, like, on their faces, camouflaging, looking scary and bigger with all this, skulls of animals on their heads. So, but they know, because they've been doing this generation after generation, they're skilled. They know how to make their enemies, getting, scared and flee. So what Carrie was telling me, I was just thinking about the movie 13 Warrior, which is one of my favorite movies.
It's a good movie. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think we're going to get to some of that when we get to David and Goliath. But right now
we came to Joshua and Caleb, who were driving out the Anakim in chapters Joshua 11, 14, and 15. So Israel is entering the land of Canaan. Joshua is leading them, right? Moses is gone. And they are facing this tribe of Anakim that the spies previously in Numbers 13, when Moses sent them, they had feared them. But this was 40 years before that. So now 40 years have passed, and Israel is entering Canaan. Joshua has to be strong and courageous, right? As the instruction of God was. And with Yahweh's fighting them, he was able to drive out the Canaanites, including the giants in Deuteronomy 1:30-31. Yes. So now Joshua and Caleb are the only one from those 12 spies who are left who believed that Yahweh would give them victory. Yep. And thus were the only two allowed to enter the land of Canaan after 40 years. Yes. So that's why God, blesses them and rewards them with this, promise. They can enter the land of honey and milk. And we see, I can read, and then you can continue after me. We read this very important passage in Joshua 11:22. It says that Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction. Again, we see the same expression. Joshua kherem, So he did this, devoted to destruction with all their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. Floor is yours. If you want to continue with Joshua 10 or any of these passages, you're good.
Yeah. I a little note that as I was doing a little bit of study into this, and noticed that in Joshua you start to see that Joshua and Caleb are the only two not genetic Israelites called out, right? Caleb is not an Israelite by blood, and neither is Joshua, but both of them are so dedicated to Yahweh. And it makes, I love looking into names. I already know what Joshua means, Yahweh is salvation, but looking up Caleb, it means dog. And it's interesting. He's not an Israelite by blood, but he is given a inheritance with the people of Israel, and his name's Dog. So now that threw me into the New Testament, where the Syrophoenician woman comes to Jesus and says, "Look, my daughter is dying, and she's possessed, or she's sick, she's dying." And he was like, "It's not good for the master to take away from the children and give it to the dogs." I think that that's a reference back to Caleb, right? And that she goes, "Yeah, but even the puppies, even the little dogs will take whatever falls from the master's table." And he goes, "Great is your faith, let it be done to you." I think that that's a story kind of like Caleb's, is that Caleb, not being an Israelite, is fully faithful to Yahweh, trusts him completely, and is like that dog that'll eat whatever you give me. Hey, I want the biggest giants that are in the land. I'll take those on if you'll let me have that land. Go get it, Caleb. And he does, right? So I thought that was a really cool picture, and I had never made that connection before, that Caleb means dog. And that you have this story, and it's an inheritance while Jesus is doing all the miracles in Israel. Someone outside of Israel gets a miracle too. I just thought that was a really cool touch. All right, so back to Joshua 10. There's 5 Amorite kings. Once again, we've talked about how the Amorites quite often are considered Rephaim. That the Gibeonites are the ones that kind of trick Joshua. They get moldy bread and ripped up clothes, and they're like, "Look, once again, this is those ideas that if you repent, you don't have to be a tyrant anymore," right? They were also considered a part of the Amorites. This is one subsection of the Amorites, the Gibeonites, that come to Joshua, make a pact with him. And so they're like, "Okay, we're not going to fight you." Well, anyways, the other Amorite kings are like, "You traitors," and they go to fight them, right? And so the Gibeonites say, "Hey, Joshua, the Amorite kings are attacking us, these 5 kings." And Joshua shows up to help them. It says, "God," and this is in this one, it's another interesting story, is that this is the fight where God makes the sun go backwards, and he sends hailstones that kills more of these giants than the children of Israel actually get to kill, right? So it's like God is joining these fights, and once again, it's that supernatural thing. You're doing something you can't do on your own. It's through me. If you'll make war, I'll win the battle for you, right? And I just think it's a really cool part. So anyways, when the kings are defeated, they run and they all hide in a cave. And so Joshua tells his people, "Hey, put a stone over the cave," kind of hints at something down the line, "and we'll come back to them later," right? So they go pursue the rest of the giant armies, defeat them, come back to the cave, pull these kings out, and then Joshua tells the war chiefs to put their heels on the necks of these giant kings before he kills them. And it just reminds me of when you have the prophecy in Genesis 3, that the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, he'll bruise their heel. The seed of the serpent will bruise his heel, but the seed will crush his head. And you have this with Joshua, same name as Jesus, right? Showing the war chiefs, the people that are following Joshua, this is how we crush serpents' heads. And I just think that that's a really beautiful picture. And the stone in front of the cave and some of the stuff that we're going to get into later, I just think is this it's priming the story for something great in the New Testament. So
yeah, it's part of it's part of the first gospel, right? Told in Genesis 3:15, and I think this will be a wonderful sermon to be preached in many churches, especially for this Easter or resurrection season. And you're right, how Joshua's name and act of slaying the serpent, right, slaying the neck of the enemy, is pointing to Christ. And whatever we do on this channel, even when we cover this insane and like scary and mythological and vague and fringe topics, we somehow always try to connect it with Jesus, giving him supremacy compared to everything. So I appreciate that you mentioned that part, because it's so beautiful. I mean, honestly, it inspires me. You can write a poem, you can make a song, you can write a sermon, you can write a book, or at least like a chapter in a book that talks about these things, because it's so important, and it runs from Genesis to Revelation.
absolutely.
And it's the theme of the Bible, where the promised Messiah, the seed with capital S, will come and crush the serpent. And because of Jesus and what he did, we can do the same through him as victorious people. I'm sorry, I'm gonna let you continue.
No, I mean that if we get to preach, we get to preach a little bit, right? It's so awesome. All right, so you have that story in Joshua 10. In Joshua 11, there is this story of Jabin, king of Hazor, that tries to fight Joshua, and he's the king in charge of the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, and the Hivites. So, like Og, king of Bashan, and Sihon, king of I don't remember where it's at, but they're both Amorite kings. Now you have Jabin, the king of Hazor, that's kind of filled into that place, the gap that was left, and he's trying to fight against Joshua too. And he's the one that has united the Canaanites, the Amorites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Hivites. That's a list that we talked about all the way back from Genesis and Exodus and probably Deuteronomy. I don't know exactly where it was. Exodus 23, that connects them to giant clans. So I think that once again, you're seeing that these names, that if I heard Canaanite, my first thought is not giant. If I hear Amorite, my first thing is not giant, unless I remember Og, king of Bashan, is an Amorite. Perizzites, not the first thing that comes to mind is giant. Jebusites, Hivites, those are the people that Joshua is warring against, and they're already been established as Rephaim. It's just not repeated in Joshua. So keeping that in mind, it's not like what Michael Heiser says. This is not just genocide of people groups taking up the space that Israel wants. This is a specific group of people that have a tyrannical lifestyle of debauchery and passion-laden tyranny. That's the thing that they're trying to eradicate. All right, so I think it's really interesting. Like you said, it's been 40 years. It makes Caleb about 85 years when he goes to war against the Anakim, which I think is really cool. Like, this old man is like just cutting him off at the ankles, and just being that warrior and going, all right, well, if he's going to let children do it, he's going to let an old man do it too, right?
But this is another passage where God supernaturally shows grace and gives power to regular, ordinary people like you and me. Can you imagine that you have the same amount of energy, health, and strength when you're 85 and 40? That is literally, I don't care how much time you spend in the gym, drinking healthy food, taking vitamins. When you're 85, you will not be as strong, because your body loses bone structure. Your muscles are losing their mass. Like, this is normal. This is natural. When you're 85 and you're still strong as you were 40, this is the sign of supernatural intervention on your behalf. So this is, again, very, to me, all these little details, these layers, they build up on the whole case of just how the whole story is amazing, when it comes to the war on giants. And then we came to the last two subsections of this section on the war of giants, and both of these are about David, dealing with the giants. So we can talk about David killing the famous giant Goliath in 1 Samuel 17, and this is happening again, like I said, after Joshua after Joshua's story. And if you want to continue at any point, let me
Yeah.
know.
For the sake of time, I think that there's a lot of people that are going to be familiar with this. So I think that we don't need to spend a whole lot of time in this section, but I do want to highlight something when it comes to Goliath. We've already established where he comes from, when he's an offspring of the Anakim, that he's a giant, but it's his armor. And one of the things that, like what Carrie just asked about, what type of armor that were they wearing? So during the time of David, it would be after the Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age, which means bronze is actually old technology, right? By a couple hundred years, right? And history, like I said, I'm not as good at referencing actual articles and things like that, but you can look into it. When was the Iron Age? When was David supposedly alive? And you'll notice that the Iron Age had already started, the Bronze Age had already ended. And so you have this giant that is completely armored in bronze armor. It's an old technology. It's one of those ancient things. And bronze, the word bronze and the word used in Hebrew for bronze is fiery, and it's scale armor. So you have this connection, like mentioned here. I guess I kind of want to read it because it's really well put here. Where did I? There it is. David did not just defeat some random giant that Saul and the Israelites feared. Rather, Goliath is the remnant of the Anakim that Israel was supposed to drive out of the land of Canaan. It's also important to mention that Goliath wore bronze scale armor. Syrian or Shirion Kaskizim is the Hebrew word behind it. It's in 1 Samuel 17:5. You can look into it. This armor weighed over 125 pounds, implying that he was massive. And is there a connection between this and the serpent as well as Dagon, right? So you have this fiery serpent armor connected to fiery serpent. Once again, seed of the serpent, seed of the woman.
And the seraphim in the Old Testament, right?
Yes, right. So there's this ongoing motif. Once again, it's the thread. Once you know what you're looking for, you see it woven through so many different stories. So the bronze scale armor ramps up the significance as it connects Goliath with the serpent himself. Goliath was the seed of the serpent, and David was the seed of the woman. Whether Goliath was the biological offspring of the serpent through the Nephilim, or merely the spiritual offspring, there's connections with Genesis 3:15. David killed Goliath with a stone to the head, and then he cut off Goliath's head with his own sword, right? So giving a hint, projecting onto Christ, he defeats death. He defeats the giant with his own weapon. He defeats death by death. David, the seed of the woman, crushed the head of the seed of the serpent. Thus, David's defeat of Goliath is ultimately a picture of Christ conquering the devil. Now, here's something that's very interesting. At the end of, let's see, we went through that. At the end of the story, Goliath falls face down. David cuts off his head, and then there's this little verse that says, and David took Goliath's skull to Jerusalem. Now, if you know anything about where this is at in Samuel, David didn't take over Jerusalem until he was king. So he brings the skull to Jerusalem, and it's mentioned right after he kills Goliath. All right, so just to keep this in mind, Goliath from Gath, and his skull is in Jerusalem. That's a hint for something that comes later. All right, so is there anything else that you wanted to highlight with David and Goliath specifically?
Well, just the parallel with God Dagon, because the same way Goliath fell, also the statue of God Dagon in 1 Samuel 17 fell down face down,
Yes.
and it lost its limbs. Right, the head was also cut off. So we see parallel between all these serpentine, demon-like, Rephaim-like, creatures, deities, giants, because they all serve the same boss, the same entity, and
Yes.
it's not a coincidence.
Yes.
And the same thing that in the same fashion that Joshua previously defeated Rephaim, now David is defeating this Rephaim, and again we see this
The head has to
beautiful
be cut off.
biblical theme. They just keep continuing repeating until we see all this fulfillment through different prophets and different kings. We see all this fulfilled in Jesus and what He will do, but we're saving that for the last part of the episode. And now
Okay.
the last the last section when it comes to Gigantomachy, when David is facing, and his men called Giborim, the mighty man, they're facing the rest of the giants, and finally they slaughter the rest of the giants. And to that point, as we know, there are no more giants. I mean, there are different Christian researchers with their theories how giants still may there be, or how people can manipulate their DNAs through science and forbidden knowledge and this, that. We're not going to that because we don't know, and that's not the point of tonight's topic. But we're turning to 2 Samuel 21 and 1 Chronicles 20. Like I said, David is going with his Giborim, or mighty men, to take the rest of the giant clans. I mean, specifically Goliath's clan and the Amalekites. Do you want to continue from this point, and so we can finish with the Old Testament?
Yeah, I just covering it. This is the end of the War of the Giants. David completes it with his mighty men. And then you think, what's the next generation? Solomon was not at war at all, right? So like I said, once the war on the giants is complete in that area. Now, does that mean, like you said, does that mean there's not giants elsewhere? Oh, I'm pretty sure there's giants elsewhere. The Norse mythology has that built into it. Greek mythology has that built into it. There's a reason why in the Maccabees reach out to the Spartans and say, hey, we're brothers. We're related to Abraham in our war. Will you save us from the giants, the tyrants that are coming? Will you help? Will you ally with us this time against the giants that are attacking us? Right. So there's this ongoing perspective that's throughout all of scriptures that up to this point, Canaan is free of giants. And then what happens? Peace. Right. Now, was that peace maintained? That's another episode and another story. But I think that sums this up really well when it comes to the end of the physical war on the giants.
Yeah, and again, like this is what we know from the Bible. What happens after that, we can only speculate from extra-biblical sources. But at least when it comes to Israel and the Promised Land, this is the end. David and his men are killing these giants. And if someone wants to learn more when it comes to different mythologies and extra-biblical sources, go ahead and study more on that. And if you ever wonder, well, how these other giants came to be, again, we can only speculate. There are different schools of thought. But we think, when I say we, I don't think just Troy and myself, but also different guests we are bringing and partners on the podcast, that most likely, even though we cannot say 100% that we are sure, the giants came to be through these sexual rites that were repeated throughout the ancient times through different civilizations. And these rites, as we see, dissecting different cultures, these things were well known through the ancient people. So if you wonder how that came to be, well, maybe by using this forbidden knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so let's see. I wanted to see if I had any scriptures to pull out right now, but I don't. Okay, so
it's a really long passage from 2 Samuel 21, 15 to 22, when he talks about descendants of the giants, their spear being 300 shekels of bronze. Now, 300 shekels of bronze sounds a lot, but I think it's mentioned like 7 pounds, so that's not that much. I think I was reading in the NIV today, so then that's not so bad. Like, it doesn't sound like, like the scale that Goliath had, like 120 pounds,
you said
right?
700, you said 700 shekels?
No, it says in the chapter, it says 300 shekels of bronze. Yeah.
Oh, it is. I'm looking that up right now because I don't remember.
Yeah, you can look. I'll continue talking when it comes to this passage. And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob, and the Elhanan, the son of Jari, Oregon, very strange names. The Bethlehemite struck down Goliath, and the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like the weaver's beam.
Yep.
That's interesting. And there was a war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers. This is very interesting. 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. And he was also descendant from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David. and by the hand of his servants. Again, this is in 2 Samuel 21,
Yeah.
and this is the last part of the, not just not just books that come in the after the Pentateuch, but the whole Old Testament when it comes to the world and giants. This is the last the last section where we have it recorded.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I'll
No,
let you continue.
no, I think that wraps up our Old Testament part of it, that we've kind of painted this picture. And then if this is where Tim Stedman's work on what are the origins of the demons in the New Testament, and the discussion that he has, and I think that it's episode 17, your interview with him, does a really, really good job of building the case that the War of the Giants continues, but it continues on a different plane. And now we come to the New Testament, where we're talking about the work of Christ. And I think that this is where some of the narrative structures that we've established and kind of pulled out and what we've discussed so far starts coming together, and you start seeing these beautiful connections that make Genesis 6 an important part, that makes Gigantomachy, the book of Joshua, the book of Deuteronomy, and the things that it talks about, the book of Numbers, and the wars that Israel was supposed to have when it comes to the Rephaim and the Nephilim. All of that culminates in what Christ accomplishes and the things that he's doing. So I think that, not to repeat too much of what Tim covered, but one of the things that he talks about is that in the book of Enoch, it talks about that these giants, when they die, they don't go to heaven or hell, but they stay as tortured souls, demons that will desire to possess bodies so that they can fulfill their passions, because they are now bodiless, but they still have all of their passions. Imagine being a glutton but never being able to eat, or being lazy and never being able to sleep, right? All of those things have been stored up in them, and they're just looking for people to be their tools to meet their passions. This is where intertestamental writing kind of goes, all right, what are these demons that are now showing up? That's the theory that the New Testament is running with when it comes to demons and Jesus commanding demons to leave people. So that's just a little bit of overview of what Tim covered. I don't want to go too far into it because his was way better job developing and discussing that. So to start the idea, Jesus combats and defeats the evil spirits, the same beings that are defeated in the Old Testament, demons that originate from the Nephilim. Christ came to destroy the works of the devil. To be demonized is the opposite of theosis, demonization versus divinization. And like we said, these demons are the leftover spirits of the dead Rephaim. All right, so now that we've covered all of this, the book of Joshua and the War on the Giants, Gigantomachy, is kind of the centerpiece thread that we've been focusing on for a while, that goes from at least Genesis 6 through the Gospels and Acts, because we get to join God in his Acts, right? Through the Gospels and onto the book of Revelation. And we've mentioned some of the things in Revelation, so I probably won't cover that in too much detail. But some of the things that you see, the beast, king, tyrants that Jesus slays with the sword of his mouth, Magog and Og, the connection through Greek and Old Testament, which we've already talked about. So one of the things that I wanted to really, I thought this is probably one of the coolest things that I discovered years ago. And if anybody is a scholar in Greek, I'd love to hear more on this, but this is just me as a layman. So if it's wrong, I'm totally wrong. All right. So there's a word, okaterion. It only happens twice in the New Testament. I haven't been able to do a really good search in the Old Testament, like the Septuagint, but it happens in Jude 1:6 and 2 Corinthians 5:2. And so keeping an idea of Genesis 6 in mind, I want to read Jude 1:6 and 2 Corinthians 5:2. So let me pull that up real quick. Sorry, I should have pulled it up while I was talking, not after I stopped. 6. Okay, so says, I'm going to start in verse 5. Now, I desire to remind you, though you know all things once for all, that the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe, something that we covered today. They didn't join in Gigantomachy. And the angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode. So this is plural, angels. There's only one story in the Old Testament where a plural, angels, did something where they left their abode and were judged for it. He has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. All right, so that term, okaterion, abode, it's means their proper habitation or house. Okay, so if you look that word up, there's only one other place that it shows up. And I want you to, this is so cool. All right, so I'm going to start in verse 1 of chapter 5 of 2 Corinthians. For we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed the house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, inasmuch as we, having put it on, will not be found naked. For indeed, while we are in this tent, we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but to be further clothed, so that what is mortal will be swallowed up by life. Okay, so this is talking about resurrection and the life of the age to come. That word, okaterion, is clothed with our dwelling from heaven. It's only used twice, one where the angels left theirs and one where we gain ours. So I think that's a really wonderful picture of Genesis 6, the fallen divine council. Some things that we've talked about Michael Heiser is that where the angels left, God is preparing a place for us. Just like Gigantomachy. They took over Canaan, and the partnership that Israel had with God was to war against the giants and take their place in that land. So same thing. So you see that connection there.
Can I please just say something to help
Oh,
the
yeah.
case? So I'm on blueletterbible.org, which is a phenomenal source for all the Christians to understand the Bible in its original languages. So in this case, I was just checking the word what it means in Greek, and you're right. It's mentioned only 2 times in the New Testament, and it does mean what you said: a dwelling place or a habitation. The second meaning is of the body as the dwelling place for the spirit, which is very interesting. And besides being mentioned 2 times in the New Testament, it's also mentioned in Apocrypha, 2nd Maccabees 11, 3rd Maccabees 2.
Okay.
Then also Josephus uses this, Plutarch, and some other ancient historians and philosophers. I just want to mention that for the sake of context, because it contributes and helps the case we're building. But in this case, what you're saying, that it is true, and it is mentioned, as you said, in this proper context, and it wasn't just used in the New Testament by Paul and Jude. It was also used in Apocrypha that came before the New Testament canon.
Can you look up how it's used, like the verse or the sentence that's around it?
I can. Let me just
That would be
Google
cool.
it. Yeah. Okay, let me just see. So 2nd Maccabees 11:2. Okay. Verse goes, well, let me start with 1. So 2nd Maccabees 11:1 and 2. Very soon after this, Lysias, the king's guardian and kinsman, who was in charge of the government, being vexed at what had happened, gathered about 80,000 infantry and all his cavalry and came against the Jews. He intended to make the city a home for Greeks. So I think this just helps what you said. It is a home, right?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. There we go. So that's how it's being used, is that the home that the fallen angels or the rebellious angels left is the home that we're being given. And I think that's a really beautiful picture. And once again, a continuation of this thread of Gigantomachy replacing the tyrants and the giants with those that are in the likeness of God. And I think it's a beautiful picture, and it's continuing into the New Testament. All right, so I wanted to we mentioned Mount Hermon, and I wanted to I think I have 2 bullet points out of order, so I want to do the Mount Hermon one first. So There's the story in Matthew where he's at Caesarea Philippi. And so you mind if I share? I'm going to share another picture. So let me
Yeah, please
present.
go ahead. I think it helps people who are visual like me
Yes.
learn better that way.
Where's it at? There we go. Okay. So this is an actual picture, not just that digital form. So if you look at this, this is Mount Hermon. You see where it's where it's at, and you see Caesarea Philippi and that little circle. It says, and the sacred cave. And then you've got the Nimrod's fortress. We don't exactly know. They know various different iterations. It probably started around 200 or 300 years BCE. So that's been there a while. It was not always called Nimrod's fortress, but it's just something interesting that it's called Nimrod's fortress, and we're talking about giants and Mount Hermon and its relationship, and that this is the land of Bashan, where Caesarea Philippi is. So once again, this is the place where Og, king of Bashan, ruled, and this is the Greek city that was made at the bottom of Mount Hermon. All right, so I am going to. So that little circle that says sacred cave, this next picture is the sacred cave that we're talking about. So this is the ruins that you see there. This is the grotto of Pan. I don't really like this 3D stuff, but it was the only picture that really saw this this watery cave that's at the foot of Mount Hermon. And they believe that this was a gateway to the underworld, and this was built to the god Pan, right, in Caesarea Philippi. Okay, so in Matthew, let's see, let me go back to our notes. All right, so I can stop sharing there. There we go. All right, so back to our notes. In Matthew 16, 13 through 20, you have the story where Jesus travels to Caesarea Philippi, and he's sitting with his disciples, and he says, who do other people say that I am? Well, some the prophet, some Elijah, some this. Well, who do you say that I am? Well, you're the Son of God, Peter responds. And Jesus' response to Peter is, blessed are you, Peter, for only the Father could reveal that to you. And I will call you, Petros, because upon this Petros, may have gotten those backwards, I will build my church. Where's he at? He's at Caesarea Philippi. He's looking at the grotto of Pan. He's talking to Peter, who just said, no, you're the Son of God. So humans have recognized that he's the Son of God. And he's saying, upon this Petros, this cliff, you're a boulder, but upon this cliff face, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. What's at Caesarea Philippi? A gateway to the underworld, Hades. He's pointing it out right there. All right. So right after that, it says, from this point forward, he talked to them about his coming death. Right. And that's where 5 verses later, Peter's like, Lord, let it never be. And that's when Jesus goes, get behind me, Satan. Satan, you're thinking of the things of men and not the things of God. The war on the giants has to continue. We have to finish this job. Right. Okay. So says that 6 days later, they climbed a very high mountain. So if we go back to that first one that I presented, let's just share screen. Is that it? Yes. We go back to that. Most commentators will say that he climbed Mount Carmel way over here. Okay. They're right here. So they would have to be jogging to get to Mount Carmel, to climb Mount Carmel for the transfiguration. But the highest mountain in the area is right here. Okay, so 6 days later is when he climbs a mountain, a very high mountain. The highest mountain in the area is Mount Hermon, and that's where the transfiguration happens. Okay, as we talked about earlier, all of the people, including the Jews, when they're talking about the cultures around them, believe that the gods descended on this mountain. And God, the real one, climbs up this mountain and then transfigures there. he's picking a fight with all the so-called gods and saying, here I am, I'm the real thing. What are you going to do about it? Right? He's picking that fight. And I just think that is such an awesome, awesome picture of this is covered in much greater detail in Reversing Herman from Michael Heiser, but it's also the Orthodox perspective of what's going on with Jesus's ministry and points of what's the transfiguration for and why, where is it at? This is where it's at. And he is talking with Elijah and he's talking with Moses, and he is picking a fight with the supernatural realm, the leftover Raphaim, the giant kings. Right? Okay, so
If I just can add one
Yeah.
little thing, we know this, but not everyone knows this. And this was happening above the entrance of the cave that
Yes.
we saw in the previous slide. That was called literally the gates of hell. So when Jesus said that on this church, on this rock I will build my church, he was, like you said, picking the fight, but showing his spiritual majesty and supremacy over the fallen demon Rephaim, local deities of that time. He was telling them, "Oh, you think this place belongs to Pan and belongs to your local god,
Mhm.
Zeus, whatever? I'm gonna build my church on your entrance to
Mhm.
Hades, to Sheol, to hell, and I'm gonna show how we will prevail." So I just want to add that, because the actual place of the gates of hell, it's not just a word that we can use when we are explaining something or preaching the gospel, but it was the
Mhm.
actual location. That's how the entrance of the cave was called. I just
Yes.
wanted to add that.
Yeah, and I think that it's a wonderful picture of what's going on here. So I wanted to read a couple verses where no, I think I can wait. I think we can go back to the Golgotha and Goliath and Og, king of Bashan connection before I read these verses. All right, so now we have. Remember, we talked about at the end of that chapter where David kills Goliath that he takes his skull to Jerusalem. All right, so in Matthew 27:33, it says, and the place that Jesus was crucified was called Golgotha, which translated means place of the skull. Now, I have tried to find, well, what language is Golgotha? What does it mean? Where does it mean place of the skull? There is no place. There is no language that Golgotha means place of the skull. I guess I can stop sharing this now. So where's that coming from? Well, if you someone who is from Gath is called a Gittite. Goliath is from Gath, so Goliath the Gittite, Golgotha, right? The recognizing that the oh my gosh, the vowels are not necessarily in Hebrew, not necessarily like set in stone. There's something that was added later. So if you just look at the consonants, it's the same that you would say if you were saying Goliath of Gath. So it's a theory. I don't really know how established that could be, but my guess is that if we were to take that and go Golgotha, Goliath of Gath, hey, there's a verse in Scripture that says that David took the skull of Goliath and put it in Jerusalem, and Golgotha is right outside of Jerusalem. Is this the place of Goliath's skull? And then you think about what's the prophecy? That the seed of the serpent's head will be crushed where his heels will get bruised. And it's like this full picture, this thread that goes all through Scripture. And it's such a beautiful, like, oh, wow. That, like, I like how Chuck Misler said it. He goes, I've been questioning whether or not I take the Bible literally. And it's no, I take the Bible seriously. And the more that I study it, the more serious I take it. This little thread was one of those things that when I found it, I was just like, oh, wow, that fits. Whether or not I'm right, and I'm totally okay with being corrected. I'm a nobody, right? I'm totally okay with being corrected. But that is one of the coolest things that I saw in Scripture, that there's this one verse that says, well, the skull of Goliath is in Jerusalem. is taken to Jerusalem, or the area of Jerusalem. And Golgotha is the place of the skull, and there's no language that translates from Golgotha to place of the skull. So let's see. Okay, Og, king of Bashan, and the crucifixion. Here's another one that I think is really beautiful. In Psalm 22, the one that starts with, my God, why have you forsaken me? There is a couple verses in there that I always found really interesting because they don't make sense. So let's see if I can pull that up real quick. Man, you got to remind me to look up the scriptures before I finish talking. Just dead space. All right, Psalm 22.
And by the way, for the context, this is one of those messianic, so-called messianic
Yes.
psalms in the Old Testament pointing to Jesus.
Absolutely. Okay, so in verse 11, so we've already talked about, let's see. If you've read this verse before, it's the one that talks about they pierced my hands and my feet, they cast lots for my clothing, but I'm a worm and not a man, a reproach among men, despised by the people, all who see me sneer at me. So it's very prophetic about what is happening during the crucifixion. Okay, so in verse 9, it says, yet you are he who brought me forth from the womb. You made me trust when upon my mother's breast. Upon you I was cast from birth. You have been my God from my mother's womb. Be not far from me, for trouble is near me, for there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They open wide their mouth at me as ravening and a roaring lion. I'm poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It melts within me. Now, if you look at any of most commentaries, they will understand the verse before and the verse after it talks about the bulls of Bashan that are carnivorous bulls. What are they? Right? Okay. So
we just mentioned that part like an hour ago. Like most people without the context, they would just think these are mere animals.
Right. Like what is why is he referencing that he's surrounded by bulls of Bashan? What are they? Big bulls? What is the thing that why are they ravenous? Why are they opening their mouths like lions? And then if you think about what was the form that Aaron turned the gold into when, well, I mean, of course, if you just say it, it's a golden calf, right? And there is multiple. Baal is considered a bull. Moloch is considered with a bull head, right? So you have all of these different gods from the area, and the concept of gods in that time period were bulls represented God. Okay, so now Mount Hermon just happened. Transfiguration just happened. He just accosted the gods at the place where they're supposed to have their most power, where they came down. And now he's surrounded by the bulls of Bashan. Are these the gods of Og? Is this the divine ones that made him 2/3 divine? Is this what made Gilgamesh 2/3 divine? Is this what made all the giants 2/3 divine according to their belief system? Was the god that possessed them during that ritual? He's surrounded by them, right? So it's question. I'm not scholarly enough to go, yeah, that's what it is. I have asked a few people in my church, and they were like, yeah, that's the Orthodox perspective, that these are the gods of the giants, the bulls of Bashan that surround him. So this plays into, go ahead.
No, I just want to ask you, is your understanding that this was happening when Jesus is arrested just before crucifixion? Is this your understanding?
I think this is on the crucifixion, right? This is during the crucifixion.
Okay, so just before he dies, right? Okay.
Yes, that he's surrounded not just by the people, not just by the Romans, not just by the people sneering at him, which it covers in the couple verses before, but God trust. You have allusions to Gethsemane where he's going, God, not my will, but yours be done. I trusted you from my mother's breasts. I'm going to do what you've asked me to do, but I am surrounded by the bulls of Bashan. And then you think about what did Paul say? If the principalities and powers, the elemental spirits of the world knew what they were doing when they crucified the Son of God, they never would have done it. Now,
so know why I'm asking what is your understanding? Because I was thinking, could it be possible that he was surrounded by the bulls of Bashan once when he died, and when he starts this journey of 3 days, before he goes to rescue these souls, it says in Colossians 2:15 that we didn't plan to talk about this, but
Yeah.
this is a good parallel, right? Especially important for the Easter slash
Today,
resurrection season.
resurrection.
So
Yep.
if Jesus defeats these fallen ones and he exposes them, embarrasses them publicly, I'm thinking, could this be related with bulls of Bashan? And if so, then maybe it wasn't just before he's crucified. Maybe that continued at the beginning when his body dies, but of course his spirit, his soul cannot die because he's God. And then he goes and deals with these fallen entities, divine entities of the bulls of Bashan, but he
Mhm.
actually exposes them, before God, before other principalities. He's like, look, these are nothing. I'm stronger than them, and I'm showing you who these entities are, so you can know their identity and not be afraid of them. So I'm thinking, could this be also past when Jesus dies? Then he's really, if he was in any way in human form, um, if he was, I have to say this properly because some people would crucify me if I take away anything from Jesus' divinity. If Jesus subdued himself to come in the form of a flesh, to be in the
Mhm.
form of the servant, and if in his human life, in his incarnation, he was willingly abandoning some of the divine attributes, right?
It was veiling them.
Yes, he was veiling them. So in that context, he didn't defeat them because he was in human flesh. He didn't defeat them in his life, in his
Mm.
incarnation. So then he waits when he dies to show them like big, aha, see, I'm not dead. That's what you were expecting.
Yes.
You were rejoicing, but I'm not dead. Like I'm alive in all the centuries because I'm
Yes.
eternal. So then he comes in his full power when he's not just limited by his human flesh, and then he comes and he's like destroys them. So I'm thinking this
Yeah.
could have happened in that
The
time where it was like,
the
when he was transiting from earthly life to
Yep.
this spiritual life within those 3 days when he was
I I think that you're on the right track. There's a it's not a Gnostic, but it's an extra biblical gospel called the Gospel of Nicodemus and the Acts of Pilate, and it's a 30-minute read, but it is a retelling with like a Jewish retelling of what happened during the 3 days in between Christ's death and his resurrection. And it's him going to Hades. And it is an interaction between Satan and the god Hades and them freaking out because, it's the counter narrative is all the gods that go to Hades to get information, right? Is that they have to go to Hades. There's a prophet in Hades that has the information they need. They have to sort through all the false prophets. They get the right prophet. They finally get the information. They can leave Hades once they get the right information. The counter narrative that's being told here. So it's being told from Jewish perspective, but a counter narrative to all of the hero myths of them going to Hades is that all of the prophets that are there are the true prophets. And they've been saying, Hades, we talked about this. We talked about, hey, you ancient doors, you better open up because the King of Glory is coming in, right? And then a second one, open up doors. I know that you're not usually two-way, but it's time to open up and let the king go back out, right? And there's this Psalms and all these different Psalms that come out and all these different prophecies in Isaiah that he would be cleansed from his wound and that he would see his offspring, even though he offers himself as a sacrifice, Isaiah 53. There's a whole bunch of verses that go into it. So it's a commentary that's putting those things together. So whether or not that's why it's extra biblical. It's not actually whether or not you could go, this is what happened, but this is what the first and second century Christians were thinking happened during this period of time. And so you have this perspective that the dead kings are being accosted by Jesus. So the way that the Orthodox Church says it is that Jesus was the divine ipecac. I don't know if you know what ipecac is. It causes you to throw up. Is that he, like you said, veiled himself to the point where Hades thought it was taking another man and found that it had swallowed God, and God cannot be circumscribed. So it burst the belly of Hades. Right. Right. So there's this point where it thought it was taking another man, right? The in Genesis, um, man is said, you are dust and to dust you shall return. And then the curse on the serpent is that you will be devouring dust your entire life, or that's your job now, is to devour dust. So the serpent has been devouring dust for however many generations. The serpent has had the power of death for however many generations. And he thinks, oh, I'm just taking another man, and founds that he's tried to swallow God. And it rips his stomach open. That's why at the resurrection, many people came out of their tombs, not just Jesus. So,
Man, it's beautiful. It's wonderful. I also want to say, in the same way that you mentioned, 2 episodes I did about the Nephilim with Tim Stedman. We also did 2 episodes a year ago for the previous, I think, Easter season when we did with Joshua, with Sherry. I'm sorry, with Carrie. You were also on one of the episodes, Paul. So I think I should post also those links so people can go and explore what
absolutely.
was happening in those 3 days before Jesus' death and resurrection.
Yeah.
Troy, for the end, maybe if you want to summarize another New Testament perspective that Dr. Heiser mentions in chapter 5 of his book, Reversing Herman. Uh, what did some scholars start noticing when it comes to genealogy in the Gospel of Matthew, which is very Hebrew-like, very. If you want to learn the depths of Matthew's Gospel, you will have to know the depths of, the Hebrew culture, right? So he named chapter 5 the sin of the watchers and the genealogy of Jesus. So can you please summarize this chapter, and give us some names? Why is this so beautifully dissected by Dr. Heiser? And he also quotes another scholar who found some very interesting correlation between, these giants and the spirits of the Nephilim versus Jesus' genealogy in
All right.
Matthew.
Yeah, I think that this, given that we kind of started this episode talking about the sexual rituals that were associated with creating divine giants, we have this genealogy of Jesus in Matthew that includes 4 women, but it doesn't include the patriarchal women. It doesn't include Sarah. It doesn't include Rebecca. And it doesn't include Rachel, but it includes people, Judah's daughter-in-law. And I, off the top of my head, I can't remember their names. I'm looking for them in this outline. It includes people like Judah's daughter-in-law, who he refused to give his youngest son to because the 2 older sons had married her, and they both died before giving them sons. So he's afraid to give his youngest son. And then she acts like a concubine and a prostitute, and has a child by Judah, and she's said to be more righteous than Judah was. And one of the children from that offspring was Perez, which means breaker. And I think it's just a beautiful name. That's which is 8 generations from David in David's lineage, right? And that's, sorry, that was a rabbit trail I don't really want to get into, but it's really cool that's the 8th generation from David. He's hold on. I just had a thought. I just lost it. Okay, I'm not going to go down. I'm going to try to recover that thought. It's already gone. All right. So the next person that's in there is the Rahab from Jericho, right? Where she's her and her family are the only ones in that city that was erem to survive. And so she marries Solomon, another person that is, I think, the great-grandfather or the father of Boaz, right? And then you have Ruth is mentioned, right? I think Ruth is the other one. And she's is it a Moabite? I think it's a Moabite, right? So she's outside the circle of Israelites, and she's brought in. And the way that she gets into it is once again through a sexual ritual, right? She's told uncover between his legs, which is a euphemism for uncovering his genitals, and lay there. And when he wakes up, he's going to know what to do. Why? Because there's a sign of the covenant, and he's the kinsman redeemer, and he'll know what to do to bring you in and to take care of you. So you have that.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add one sentence. This is a beautiful explanation and context. When single women, I hear them saying, "Oh God, give me Boaz," I'm like, really know you understand the context. Like, that means not just to marrying a wealthy person, which is already making you sound materialistic, but it's also like, do you know that could have been sexual intercourse before marriage? And are you okay with that as a Christian? And now I'm not in that sense judging someone, because we all fall short of God's glory, we all sin. But I
And it
mean,
was
people
at
are
the
like, God,
instructions of
I'm
her
ready.
mother-in-law.
Yeah, I hear so many single women, God, I'm ready, bring me my boss. I'm like, I don't think you want boss, because then you'll have to be ready to do this in the middle of the night while he's sleeping, and you shouldn't be doing this. So
Right.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to say I've been waiting for years to have platform to mention this little detail, because it would drive me nuts and make me laugh. Sorry for that.
Oh no, I totally get it. So, what else? What was the fourth one? I don't remember who the fourth.
Tamara, I forgot.
Yeah, tomorrow's the first. Tomorrow's the first one. I just didn't remember her name. I don't remember the fourth one. Okay, but you get the point that each one of those, in some way, shape, or form, is outside the covenant people, brought in through either some form of sexual or was associated with sexual. I mean, even when it comes to Rahab, she's a prostitute. What type of prostitute? Was she a concubine? The type of concubine that was a part of the ritual practice of creating divine ones for Jericho, that was harem. Why were they harem? Because they were part of the giant clans. Was she a part of that, willful or unwillful? And she's the one that responds to the spies with a spiritual response, like, we know that your God is the real God, and if you can just save my family, I'll save you in this moment. And that's what happens. So you have these four women that are brought into Jesus's genealogy for the purpose of going, hey, he's reversing something. There's hope that even through this, for lack of a better word, tainted bloodline, right, the Son of God is still able, with trust and obedience, Mary, right? The person that reversed in some way, shape, or form how Eve was deceived and was disobedient, Mary was obedient. Let it be done to me as you have said. And once again, it's a strange, somewhat sexual, not sexual as in, like, how do you have a kid? Right? People are going to ask questions when you say, well, God did it. Like, it's one of those things. It's like, she knew what she was getting into when she's saying, all right, I'm going to obey. I don't understand why I can't say no. I'm going to say yes, because God's the one asking of me. I don't know why I can't eat from this tree, but I'm not going to eat from this tree. Right? She obeys. And because of that, Christ comes into the world. So there's this reversal of some of the things that were happening with the Watchers and the fallen angels. It's a redemption of humanity who were deceived by the angels, right? It's one of those power dynamics. The angels came to women and took whoever they wanted. And because of that, and you see that in Enoch in Genesis 6. So I think that's a really beautiful, interesting insight. Once again, genealogies, they're really boring to read, but they always have treasures in them. So
Yeah, I can
yeah.
say, I can just add to this that Dr. Heiser, in the 5th chapter of his book, Reversing Herman, he came up with a general thesis for that chapter, repairing the damage caused by the Watchers. And in that chapter, he focuses on the New Testament scholar Amy Richter. It's Richter, something like that. It's not Richter, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like German. And she believes that what she calls the Enochic Watchers template is essential for understanding the woman in the genealogy of Jesus. She summarizes this template early in her recent study, and this is how it goes. According to the Enochic Watchers template, evil that came in the world when the Watchers transgressed their heavenly boundary to engage in illicit sexual contact with women and teach them illicit arts. The consequences of the Watchers' transgressions are violence, unrighteousness, evil, idolatry, and disease. Some of these consequences come from human use of skills taught by the Watchers, skills for seduction, war making, sorcery, and astrology. For ancient readers of Matthew's Gospel who knew the specifics of Enoch's story of the sin of the Watchers, the genealogy the theological strategy of the genealogy would have been evident. So the scholar Amy Richter, she notes that the writer of the gospel, according to Matthew, was familiar with themes and traditions about the antediluvian patriarch Enoch, including the story of the fall of the watchers, and shows that Jesus brings about the eschatological, so end of times, repair of the consequences of the watchers' fall. In Matthew's gospel, the foreshadowing of repair and then the repair itself are seen in the evangelist's genealogy and infancy narrative. The women of the Hebrew Bible, named by Matthew in his genealogy of Jesus, foreshadow the reversal of the watcher's transgression. All four of these ladies are connected with the Anakic Watchers template. They use the illicit arts, but the use of these skills lead to righteousness rather than evil. The women also are connected with other aspects of the Anakic Watchers template, including sexual interaction, which you just mentioned recently, which connects the earthly and heavenly realms, interaction with angels, unusual aspects of their offspring, and connection with giants. In the birth narrative, Matthew shows the birth of Jesus occurring in a way that reverses the Watcher's transgression and evil in the world as it occurs in the Anakim template. Specifically, the birth of Jesus occurs through the union of a woman and celestial being. So the same thing like in Genesis 6, but this is the righteous, the divine, the proper way. So in contrast to the Watcher's story, no sexual relations are involved. Further, in Matthew's narrative, the first humans outside of Jesus' immediate family to interact with the child Jesus are the Magi, who are practitioners of the illicit arts taught by the Watchers and use astrological knowledge, but not for evil. They use it to find Jesus. In the Anakic template, the Watchers bring idolatry into the world, but in Matthew, the Magi bring the appropriate object of worship, who is Jesus. So all these are beautiful perspectives. Honestly, if I didn't read this in that, Dr. Heiser mentioned in his chapter by quoting another scholar, I would never see this, because this will take so much dissecting, so much paralleling. I wouldn't even think to parallel Matthew with First Enoch and with Jewish tradition, even though I knew that, Matthew is deeply Jewish, but not even many scholars see this. So I'm so thankful for these fine details, because they just bring us to the same point. Like, there's something happening here. And if you were an ancient Jew, you would see these things. But because we came thousands of years after the proper context, we need explanations like this that will help us open our eyes.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. Do you mind if I read a little bit from the Gospel of Nicodemus, the part based on your question that you had earlier about what was going on after? I think that this little quip is a discussion between Satan and Hades. So it'll take me 3 minutes to read it. And while all the saints were rejoicing, behold, Satan the prince and the chief of death said unto Hades, make thyself ready to receive Jesus, who boasteth himself that he is the Son of God, whereas he is a man that feareth death, and saith, my soul is sorrowful even unto death, and he hath been much mine enemy, doing me great hurt, and many that I had made blind, lame, dumb, leprous, and possessed he hath healed with a word, and some whom I have brought unto thee dead, them he hath taken away from thee. And Hades answered and said unto Satan the prince, who is he that is so mighty, if he be a man that feareth death? For all the mighty ones of the earth are held in subjection, mighty ones, the Gibarim, in subjection by my power, even they whom thou hast brought me subdued by thy power. If then thou art mighty, what manner of man is this Jesus, who, though he fear death, resisteth thy power? If he be so mighty in his manhood, verily I say unto thee, he is almighty in his Godhead, and no man can withstand his power. And when he saith that he feareth death, he would ensnare thee, and woe shall be unto thee for everlasting ages. But Satan, the prince of Tartarus, said, why doubtest thou and fearest to receive this Jesus, which is thine and adversary and mine? For I tempted him, and have stirred up mine ancient people, and with envy and wrath against him. I have sharpened a spear to thrust him through. Gall and vinegar have I mingled to give him to drink, and I've prepared a cross to crucify him, and nails to pierce him, and his death is nigh at hand, that I may bring him unto thee, to be subject unto thee and me. Hell, Hades answered and said, thou hast told me that it is he that hath taken away dead men from me? For there be many which while they lived on earth have taken dead men from me, yet not by their own power, but by prayer to God. And their Almighty God hath taken them from me. Who is this Jesus which by his own word without prayer hath drawn dead men from me? Perchance is it he which the word of his command did restore the life of Lazarus, which was 4 days dead and stank and was corrupt, and whom I held here dead? Satan, the prince of death, answered and said, it is the same Jesus. When Hades heard that, he said unto him, I adjure thee by thy strength and mine own, that thou bring him not unto me. For at that time I, when I heard the command of his word, did quake and was overwhelmed with fear, and all my ministries with me were troubled. Neither could we keep Lazarus, but like an eagle shaking himself, leaped forth with all agility and swiftness and departed from us. And the earth also, which held his dead body of Lazarus, straightway gave him up alive. Wherefore now I know that the man which was able to do these things is a God, strong in command and mighty in manhood, and that he is the Savior of mankind. And if thou bring him unto me, he will set free all that are here shut up in a hard prison and bound in the chains of their sins that cannot be broken, and will bring them into life, if his God unto the life of his Godhead forever. It's like Hades knows. I just think that it's one of those beautiful, poetic telling of, hey, what happened in between? And so,
Does it say the dating of the so-called Gospel of Nicodemus?
Let's
The second
see.
century.
I believe it is 2nd century. There's a couple different. They believe that the part that I just read is the older version or older portion, like the Acts of Pilate, the first part, and the Gospel of Nicodemus, the second part, were united into one book at around the 200s. But the part that's the Gospel of Nicodemus, the part that I was reading from, is predates the Acts of Pilate. But I don't know enough to be able to say exact date, but my guess is 2nd century. So this is really
I just
early
checked on
Christianity.
Google. I just checked in Google. It says 4th or 5th century, unless it was finalized by then.
Yeah.
Maybe it existed, portions of that existed in oral form. And usually this is how it goes with some writings. They first exist as oral form and they're passed, and when they're written down, were they written down completely or something was changed? We don't know. I honestly thought it's earlier, but I just checked a couple of websites while you're talking. It says 4th or 5th century, but yeah, there could be still some truth, because I mean the Book of Enoch came just before Jesus, right? A couple of centuries ago, even though Enoch lived thousands of years. So this is, I think, in a similar fashion. Like it wasn't recorded immediately. It was passed down.
Yeah.
But also, like with source in Pentateuch, like Moses wasn't there when God was creating everything, right? So sometimes when people want to say, well, this is just copied from ancient mythologies because their writings are earlier. Well, their writings are earlier, but that doesn't mean their events were earlier. Like,
that's
Jews didn't have writings that early. So, there's all sorts of details that you would need to know to understand that and to answer the
just
question.
To call out one of the people that are actually in the chat right now is Carrie, and Genesis Marks the Spot. She had a really good section in her most recent podcast about counter narratives, right? And I think that's really important, is that recognizing that a lot of what we see in scriptures, specifically some of the more mythological sides of things, are counter narratives, which means there's an event, historical event, and a narrative that the people around that event have a specific telling of, and that the scriptures are correcting that. Like there's a whole lot of flood narratives that are older than the Bible's flood narrative, but the flood narrative that we have assumes you know all of those and goes, well, no, God wasn't angry, he was saddened. It's the only one he was sad, right? You see that with, there's a whole lot of those. I've actually asked Carrie to see, hey, can we?
Yeah. I mean, this is also in Genesis in creation. This is in part like Baal is riding on clouds. No, Yahweh is riding on clouds. We mentioned in one episode, I think it was with Carrie several months ago, and we talked about this genre of polemics that is used by the different Old Testament authors, where they correct some pagan writings and putting in the right perspective. So that's a good conclusion. Troy, we stayed over 2 hours. At one point, when we were about to come to 1:30, I was thinking, let us just finish Old Testament and we can leave for the New Testament for next time. But because you had the energy and time and zeal to continue, I'm like, let the brother finish the story. So yeah, we went over 2 hours. I'm grateful for that. Again, I'm grateful, for your time and sacrifice. It was a blast. I'm looking forward for some other topic that we'll be together piling up, researching, studying, because this is another. See, people who don't study in groups and who don't exchange sources and material, they don't know how wonderful, beautiful, exciting these things are. And if you don't have people like that in your congregation, in your midst, then you have to do with someone you meet online. And this is the way I'm doing.
Yep.
And this brings so much joy and pleasure whenever I learn something, whenever I find out something, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have joy, I have excitement. So I'm like, let me share this with the other people. And because
Yep.
not everyone I know in person, well, most people are not interested in the same topics like I'm like, well, let me share this with the audience. It just makes me happy. I don't know. So in that spirit, I'm okay. Paul is saying I'm talking about giants every Easter from now.
Easter
Yeah,
Island giants, right?
yes, you should be, because I mean, part of the gospel is that Jesus is defeating the bulls of
Of
Bashan
Bashan.
and these fallen entities, which are demonized kings and demonized giants. So, I wasn't even thinking in this perspective honestly before you, Troy, told me and suggested this a while ago when you said let's dissect War on the Giants in the Old Testament. I'm like, yeah, that sounds fun. And then when you said, oh, but there's like a correlation with the gospel in Jesus. So I was like, okay, I have to learn more. I always
Mhm.
want to learn more. I have this, really big hunger and thirst for knowledge. And when I learn, I get so happy.
Yeah.
But yeah, in that regard, I just want to thank you for these 2.5 hours. I enjoyed. I also want to thank Paul, Carrie, and Joshua Davison was there shortly, who contributed with their questions and with their comments. Always enjoy when people are, contributing and helping to every topic. Um, I will leave you to give your concluding thoughts. But until then, I will just want to invite the audience to subscribe, to share this material, to click likes. All these things don't cost you anything except a few seconds of your time, but they help us a lot, especially because we don't have any sponsors on the channel yet. So I'm the one covering every cost. I'm not complaining, but in that regard, it will be very helpful and a blessing if you guys would continue sharing, subscribing, and all of that. Also, I'll be posting links that are related to this topic and many sources, so you can continue learning more than Troy and I covered. And if you think 2.5 hours and you still have more, yeah, there is actually much more material that no one can cover at once.
Mhm.
But in that regard, happy Easter, happy resurrection season. May God bless you. Be encouraged to study more and to see the beauty and significance of Jesus' life, death, and victory on the cross, because all these layers should bring you to see Jesus in more as more majestic,
Oh,
and see him in this awe and like, oh my God, literally, oh my God, the same way like Thomas fell and said, oh my God, like, Jesus, I love you, I worship you, my God, thank you for opening my eyes so I can understand this perspective better, because it brings more joy in me, and I can glorify you and learn about you and teach about you to others in a more proper way now that I understand all these topics. That being said, Troy, you have the honor to give the concluding thoughts.
it's hard to follow that, but I completely agree. I think that when we start analyzing the gospel in all its many aspects like a diamond, there are so many different times that you're going to come across it and go, "Oh wow, my Lord and my God," because there's so many different threads like this one. This is not the only one. This is just one, and we covered it fast, like really fast. There's a lot more
We
content.
even skipped some stuff because he could have went to 4 hours.
Yeah. So recognizing that this is a very surface level covering of this thread, and there are so many other threads. You can spend a lifetime tracking down these threads and seeing where they connect and cross in Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. The coming of the new king, the divine king, replacing the 2/3 divine. He's fully divine, but he's also fully man, right? And it's a counter narrative to these giant, partially divine, partially human kings. It is another grand story and another grand telling of the gospel. And if we get so stuck on a one-dimensional expression of the gospel, we are not going to appeal to the rising pagan in the Western world. We're not going to be able to have conversations with those that are trying to rediscover their pagan roots in many different ways, because we've denied that those stories have any relation to the story that we're telling with Jesus. And I think that it's really important. I'm horrible with names, and once again, I'm going to butcher. I'm referencing somebody, but I don't remember who. A church father said that every young Christian should first study the Greek mythology before getting into scriptures, because so much of scriptures is counter narrative to what the Greeks were telling, and that you won't get a full understanding and the magnitude of what Christ was accomplishing without knowing the war on the giants, the Gigantomachy stories. And I think that that's a very important thing, that the early church was like, you need to be educated in their myths. You need to know what they're talking about, because you're going to see where Christ connects in, changes, redeems, and brings a much deeper understanding of how he interacts with humanity. And Satan's been telling twisted truths for a long time. And what Christ accomplished is the truth, the way, the life. So that would be my closing remarks, is that I think that this is another wonderful avenue to express the gospel that might bridge to some of your more esoteric and weird friends like us.
Yes, like us. And I just want to thank you, Paul. He knew immediately the name of the church father. He said Basil the Great. See, I didn't know about this quote, and now it makes me happy that I learned something new. Now it makes me want to learn more about Basil's life and what he believed, what he wrote, what he said. And again, this is the beauty of Christianity and beauty of being a nerd and having a podcast, but also learning, from different people, and just, buying material and just, I don't know. There's so much excitement in learning. Yeah, thanks, Paul. And again, thank you everyone who stick with us and, to this time, but also to people who'll be watching in the following days, weeks, and months. I hope you're enjoying and you find this as a blessing to your spiritual growth. That being said, God bless all of you. God bless you, Troy. God bless all of you guys commenting. We shall see you next Sunday with a new topic and a new guest. Take care.